A stranger collapsed at his door in a blizzard that could bury the living, and the mountain man who saved her discovered she held the ghost of his greatest loss. Before we climb into the storm with him, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. Now let's go. The wind didn't howl in the northern ranges, it screamed. Caldershaw had learned that truth 15 winters ago when he first dragged timber up the brutal slopes to build the cabin that became his coffin. He built it high, where the altitude made breathing feel like punishment and the cold came down like judgment. He built it alone, where no voice could reach him and no memory could follow. Except memory always followed. It lived in the silence between the axe strikes. It walked behind him when he checked his trap lines. It sat across from him every night at the table he'd built for two, but only ever set for one. Tonight, the storm came early. Calder stood at the cabin's single frosted window, watching the snow turn the world into a roaring void. The pines bent and cracked under the weight of wind that had traveled 1,000 miles just to punish this particular ridge. He'd weathered worse. The mountain had tried to kill him before, with cold, with hunger, with loneliness so deep it felt like drowning in open air. It had failed every time. He turned from the window and fed another split log into the iron stove, watching the embers flare and settle. The cabin was small but solid, 12 feet by 16, chinked tight against the weather, with a sleeping loft above and storage below. Pelts hung from the rafters: marten, fox, beaver, lynx. The currency of isolation. Once a month, sometimes less, he'd haul them down to Millbrook, the frontier town that crouched in the valley below, trade them for flour and salt and rifle cartridges, then vanish back into the high country before anyone could ask questions he wouldn't answer. The townspeople called him the Ghost of Coldwater Ridge. He preferred it that way. Outside, the storm intensified. The cabin's log walls groaned under the assault. Calder moved through his evening routine with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed it 1,000 identical times. Check the stove, secure the door latch, lay out his bedroll, clean his rifle, even though it was already clean. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the heavy plank door, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Calder froze mid-motion, the cleaning rod still in his hand. Nobody came up here. Not in summer, when the trails were passable. Certainly not in winter, when the mountain became a white maze that killed the careless and the unlucky without distinction. The knock came again. Weaker this time. Desperate. Every instinct Calder had honed in a decade of solitude screamed at him to ignore it. The wilderness had rules, and the first rule was simple. Strangers meant complications, and complications meant danger. A man could survive alone. But the moment you let someone else into your world, you gave the mountain another weapon to use against you. He stood motionless, listening. A voice came through the door, thin, fractured by cold and exhaustion. "Please, I can't. Please." It was a woman's voice, old, fading. Calder's jaw tightened. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides and threw back the iron bolt. The door swung inward, and the storm tried to follow it inside. A blast of snow and freezing air that made the stove flames dance wildly. In the doorway stood a figure so small and broken that for a moment Calder thought the wind had simply hurled debris against his threshold. Then she looked up. The woman was ancient, her face carved into deep lines by decades of sun and hardship. Ice clung to her eyebrows, and the gray hair that escaped from beneath a wool scarf wrapped around her head. Her coat, once probably brown, now crusted white with frozen snow, hung on her frame like a shroud. She swayed, barely able to stand, one hand braced against the doorframe. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know where else." Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed. Calder caught her before she hit the ground, a bundle of bone and cloth that weighed almost nothing. He kicked the door shut behind him, cutting off the storm's roar, and carried her to the bench beside the stove. Up close, he could see just how close to death she'd come. Her lips were blue. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Frostbite had turned her fingertips the color of ash. He worked quickly, his movements efficient despite the shock that still hummed in his chest. He peeled away her frozen outer layers, the coat stiff as bark, the scarf crackling with ice, and wrapped her in the wool blanket from his bedroll. He pulled the bench closer to the stove and fed more wood into the fire until heat radiated through the small space. Then he waited. The woman's breathing gradually steadied. Color began returning to her face in faint traces, like watercolor bleeding back into paper. After what might have been 10 minutes or an hour, her eyelids fluttered open. She stared up at the ceiling beams for a moment, confused, then turned her head and found Calder sitting in the chair across from her, watching. "You're alive," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think so." Her voice was stronger now, though still rough. "Thank you. I thought I was going to die out there." "You were." Calder stood and moved to the small shelf where he kept his supplies. He poured water from a clay jug into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink slow." She took the cup with trembling hands and sipped carefully. "My name is Lenora Vale." Calder didn't respond. He returned to his chair and waited. Lenora seemed to understand that conversation required patience here. She took another sip, then spoke again. "I was trying to reach my daughter's family. They live beyond the Eastern Range, near Clearwater. I hired a guide in Millbrook, but 3 days ago She paused, something dark passing across her face. "He took my money and left me. Said the pass was too dangerous and he wouldn't risk it. Left me at a way station with barely enough supplies to make it back down." "So you went on alone?" Calder's tone carried no judgment, only statement of fact. "I thought I could make it. I've crossed hard country before." She looked down at her hands, at the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I was wrong." The wind hammered against the cabin walls. Snow hissed against the window glass. "You're 3 days from Clearwater in good weather," Calder said. "In this storm, you're 3 weeks. Maybe more." Lenore's face fell. "My daughter just had her first child. I've never met my grandson. I just wanted—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard. "How long will the storm last?" Calder glanced toward the window. "Days? Maybe a week? And then?" "Then the trails will be buried under 10 feet of snow, and it'll be another month before they're passable again." The reality settled over her like another weight. She closed her eyes. "I'll take you down to Millbrook when the weather breaks," Calder said. "You can winter there and try again in spring." "Thank you." She opened her eyes and looked at him directly for the first time, really looked at him, taking in the weathered face, the dark beard shot through with gray, the eyes that seemed to hold entire winters inside them. "What's your name?" He hesitated. Names were connections, and connections were exactly what he'd come up here to escape. "Calder Shaw." Recognition flickered across Lenore's face, though she tried to hide it. "You're the one they talk about in town, the mountain man." "They talk about a lot of things in town." Calder stood abruptly. "You should rest. I'll make something to eat." He moved to the small cooking area, barely more than a shelf and a pot, and began preparing a simple stew from dried venison and root vegetables. Behind him, he could feel Lenora watching, but she didn't press further. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was simply the silence of two people who had found themselves thrown together by circumstance, neither certain what to make of the other. As Calder stirred the pot, his mind worked through the implications of this new reality. A stranger in his cabin. Someone who would see how he lived, who would occupy the space he'd kept sacred for a decade. Someone who would inevitably ask questions about why a man would choose to live like this, alone, high above the world, as if altitude could create distance from the past. He didn't want to answer those questions, but the storm had made that choice for him. 3 days later. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening. Calder had been right about that, at least. The snow fell in relentless sheets, building drifts against the cabin walls that rose higher each day. He went out twice daily to clear the door and check his small lean-to shelter, where he kept his horse and emergency supplies, moving through the whiteout like a ghost navigating a familiar haunting. Inside, an uneasy routine had developed. Lenora's condition had worsened on the second day. The exhaustion and exposure had weakened her more than either of them initially realized. She developed a fever that came and went in waves, leaving her lucid 1 hour and delirious the next. Calder had seen this before. The mountain had a way of extracting payment for survival, and sometimes that payment came due days after you thought you'd escaped. He did what he could. He kept her warm, forced water and broth into her when she could swallow, placed cool cloths on her forehead when the fever spiked. It wasn't medicine, but it was all he had. On the third evening, during one of her lucid periods, Lenora broke the silence that had settled between them. "You don't have to do this, you know." Calder looked up from where he was carving a new handle for his skinning knife. "Do what?" "Take care of me like this. I'm a stranger. I forced myself into your life. The storm forced you into my life. You just knocked on the door." Still, she shifted on the bench, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Most men would have turned me away. Most men don't live up here." Lenora smiled faintly. "No, I suppose they don't." She watched him work for a moment, the rhythmic scrape of blade against wood, the only sound besides the wind. "Can I ask you something?" Calder didn't look up. "You can ask." "Why do you?" "Why do I what?" "Live up here, alone, so far from everything." There it was. The question he'd known was coming since the moment he opened the door. "Because I want to," Calder said flatly. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." Lenora studied him with eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to show. "I was a teacher," she said softly, "for 37 years. You spend that long with children, you learn to recognize when someone's running from something." Calder's hand stilled on the knife handle. "I'm not running." "No?" "No. Running implies you think you can get away from it." He set down the knife and finally met her gaze. "I just found a place where it's quiet enough to live with it." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he'd intended. Lenora nodded slowly, as if he'd just confirmed something she already suspected. "I understand that," she said. "After my husband died, I thought about doing something similar. Finding some distant place where the memories couldn't reach, but I had students who needed me, and—" She trailed off, her expression distant. "Well, life doesn't always let us choose our distance from pain." "No," Calder agreed quietly. "It doesn't." Outside, the wind shifted direction, finding new gaps in the cabin's defenses. A thin whistle of air snaked through a crack near the window frame. Calder made a mental note to re-chink it when the storm passed. "I lost my school," Lenore continued, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 years ago. Fire took it during the night. Took everything. The building, the books, the attendance records from 3 decades, all the drawings children had made, all the essays they'd written. Gone. Anyone hurt? No, thank goodness. It was summer, so the children were home, but— She paused, struggling with something. One boy had left his jacket there. His mother had sewn his name into the collar because he was always losing things. When they pulled it from the ashes, the name was still visible, somehow. Everything else burned, but that name survived. What happened to the boy? Lenora's eyes grew distant. He grew up, went to war, never came home. Something cold moved through Calder's chest, but he forced it down. I'm sorry. His name was Thomas, she said. Thomas Brennan. He was the bravest student I ever taught. Not because he wasn't afraid. He was terrified of everything when he first came to me. Afraid of speaking in front of the class. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of his own shadow. But he learned to move forward anyway. That's what real courage is, I think. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep walking despite it. Calder said nothing. He picked up the knife again and resumed carving, but his movements had lost their earlier precision. I think about him sometimes, Lenora continued. Wonder what kind of man he would have become if he'd had the chance. Wonder if anything I taught him made a difference in the end. It did, Calder said, the words emerging before he could stop them. Lenora looked at him, surprised. How do you know? Because teaching someone to be brave is never wasted, even if— He stopped, realizing he'd already said too much. Even if they die anyway? Lenora finished gently. Calder didn't answer. He focused on the knife, on the wood, on anything except the memories pressing against the inside of his skull. The fever took Lenora again that night, stronger than before. She thrashed in the grip of dreams Calder couldn't see, calling out names he didn't recognize. He stayed beside her, changing the cloths on her forehead, trying to keep her temperature down with the crude tools he had available. Somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let me become a ghost," she whispered, her eyes unfocused. "I've seen too many. The mountain is full of them." "You're not going to die," Calder said firmly. "Everyone dies. The question is whether we leave anything behind except regret." Her grip loosened, and she fell back into restless sleep. Calder sat in the chair beside her, listening to the storm rage outside and the old woman's labored breathing inside. The cabin felt smaller than it ever had, the walls pressing in with the weight of unwanted company and uncomfortable truths. He thought about Thomas Brennan, the boy who learned to be brave. He thought about all the boys who learned to be brave and went to war and never came home. He thought about one boy in particular, whose name he never spoke aloud anymore because speaking it made the absence too real. The mountain was full of ghosts. Lenora was right about that, and Calder Shaw had climbed up here 15 winters ago, hoping to become one of them. Day 6. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 6th day. Calder woke to an absence of sound that felt louder than any noise. The wind had died. The snow had stopped. Through the cabin's frosted window, weak sunlight filtered down through clearing clouds, turning the world outside into a blinding expanse of white. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb Lenora, who was finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Her fever had broken during the night, leaving her exhausted but stable. She would live. Probably. But living and recovering were different things, and recovery required supplies Calder didn't have. He dressed in his heavy winter gear, layers of wool and fur that turned him into a shapeless bulk, and stepped outside into the transformed landscape. The snow had buried everything. The woodpile was a vague mound. The lean-to had disappeared entirely under a drift that reached nearly to the roofline. The trails, already difficult to navigate in good conditions, had ceased to exist. Calder stood in snow up to his thighs, breathing the sharp, clean air that always followed mountain storms, and calculated his options. They weren't good. He had enough food for maybe 2 more weeks if he rationed carefully. He had wood for a month, assuming he could dig out the pile. But Lenora needed medicine. Real medicine, not just the wilderness remedies he could improvise. She needed willow bark for the fever, honey for her throat, possibly laudanum if infection had set in. She needed things that didn't grow at this altitude in winter. She needed the town, which meant Calder needed the town. The realization settled over him like the snow. Inevitable, inescapable, deeply unwelcome. He spent the morning digging out the lean-to and checking on his horse, a massive roan gelding named Flint, who had carried him up and down these mountains for 8 years. The horse snorted and stamped, annoyed at being confined but unharmed by the storm. "I know," Calder muttered, running a hand along Flint's neck. "I don't want to go either." But by noon, he'd made his decision. He went back inside the cabin, where Lenora was awake and sipping water from the tin cup. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo." She managed a weak smile. "But alive. Thanks to you." Calder crossed to the storage area and began pulling out supplies: rope, extra ammunition, a canvas sack for carrying goods. "I'm going down to Millbrook." Lenora sat up straighter, alarm crossing her face. "In this?" "Calder, you can't. The snow—" "I can make it. Done it in worse." He didn't look at her, focusing on checking his rifle. "You need medicine. I don't have it. That's the situation." "I'll be fine. The fever's broken. For now. Might come back. Probably will." He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow night if the weather holds. Day after at the latest. And if it doesn't hold, then I'll be back when I'm back." He finally turned to face her. "There's water in the jug, food in the pot. Keep the fire going, but don't overfeed it. Wood's got to last. You understand?" Lenora looked like she wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. "I understand." "Good." He started toward the door, then paused. Without looking back, he said, "There's a rifle by the bed. You know how to use one?" "I'm a frontier teacher. Of course I know how to use one." "Good," he said again. "Don't need it for people. Nothing human will come up here in this, but wolves might get desperate." "Calder," Lenora's voice stopped him at the threshold. "Be careful." He didn't answer. He pulled on his gloves, opened the door, and stepped out into the overwhelming whiteness. The descent took 6 hours. In summer, Calder could make the trip in 2, but winter had transformed the familiar trails into treacherous corridors of hidden crevasses and unstable cornices. He moved slowly, testing each step, leading Flint by the reins through sections too dangerous to ride. The silence was absolute. No birds sang in this weather, no small animals rustled in the brush. Just the crunch of snow under boots and hooves, and the occasional distant crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of ice. Halfway down, Calder stopped to rest at a rock outcropping he'd used dozens of times before, a small shelter where wind had scoured the snow away enough to expose bare stone. He tied Flint to a twisted pine and sat with his back against the cliff face, chewing on a piece of dried venison while staring out at the valley below. From here, he could see Millbrook. The town was a collection of dark shapes against the white landscape. Maybe 40 buildings total, clustered around a central street like settlers huddling around a fire. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray columns. Even from this distance, Calder could make out the shapes of people moving between buildings, tiny figures going about their tiny lives. He hadn't been down there in nearly 2 months. He hadn't wanted to be down there ever again. But that was the thing about the mountain. It had rules, and one of those rules was that you didn't get to hide forever. Sooner or later, the wilderness pushed you back toward the world you'd tried to leave behind, and when it did, you could either go willingly or die stubbornly. Calder had survived this long by knowing which battles to fight and which to surrender. He stood, brushed snow off his coat, and continued down. He reached Millbrook as twilight bled the last color from the sky. The town had grown since his last visit. 2 new buildings on the eastern edge, and what looked like the frame of a church rising near the center square. Progress, marching inexorably into the wilderness, whether the wilderness wanted it or not. Calder rode down the main street at a slow walk, very aware of the eyes tracking him from windows and doorways. The ghost of Coldwater Ridge, descending from his haunted mountain. They would talk about this for weeks. He stopped in front of the general store, a weathered building with faded letters spelling Carson's Supplies across the false front. Lamplight glowed in the windows. Through the glass, he could see the proprietor, Jacob Carson, moving between shelves. Calder dismounted, tied Flint to the hitching post, and pushed through the door. A bell jangled overhead. Carson looked up from the ledger he'd been writing in, and his expression went through a rapid evolution: surprise, suspicion, calculation. Shaw. Carson was a compact man in his 50s, with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime determining what things were worth. Didn't expect to see you until spring. Storm catch you low? Need supplies. Calder pulled off his gloves. Willow bark, honey. Laudanum, if you've got it. Carbolic for wounds. Clean bandages. Carson's eyebrows rose. You hurt? No? Then who? Understanding dawned across Carson's face. The old woman, the one who went missing trying to cross over east. She's up there with you? News traveled fast in small towns, even news about people who didn't come back. She's alive, Calder said. Needs medicine. You have it or not? I've got it. Carson moved toward the shelves behind his counter, then paused. People were saying she died out there. Guide came back claiming he begged her not to go on alone, but she wouldn't listen, said the mountain took her. The guide's a liar. He robbed her and left her to freeze. You know this for fact? I know she's alive and he said she was dead. Work it out yourself. Carson made a non-committal sound and began pulling items from the shelves. Small glass bottles, paper packets, a roll of white cloth. This'll do it. Willow bark for fever, honey for strength, laudanum for pain if it gets bad, carbolic for keeping wounds clean. He set everything on the counter. That's $8. 8? Calder's voice went flat. Those same supplies cost me 4 last time. Prices went up. Winter supply chain, you understand. Hard to get goods through when the passes are... Carson. Something in the way Calder said his name made the shopkeeper stop mid-sentence. I've been trading with you for 10 years, Calder continued, his voice quiet but hard as the mountain stone. Never missed a payment, never caused trouble, never asked for credit. You really want to gouge me now? Carson's jaw worked. For a moment, Calder thought the man might actually push back. But then Carson glanced toward the door, where several curious faces had appeared in the window glass, and his shoulders dropped slightly. $6, he muttered. And we're square. Calder counted out $6 from the leather pouch on his belt and slid them across the counter. Carson swept them into his cash box and began wrapping the supplies in brown paper. "She gonna make it?" Carson asked, his tone fractionally softer. "If the medicine works." "And if it doesn't?" Calder picked up the package. "Then at least I tried." He turned toward the door, then stopped as a thought occurred to him. The guide who abandoned her. He got a name? Marcus Tully, but he cleared out 2 days ago, headed south, probably back to wherever he came from. "Good for him," Calder said, and meant it. Because if Marcus Tully had still been in Millbrook, when Calder Shaw came down from the mountain, looking for medicine to save the woman Tully had left to die, the conversation would have gone very differently. Calder pushed out into the cold evening air and nearly collided with someone standing just outside the door. "Sorry, He stopped. The man in front of him was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a deputy's star pinned to his heavy coat. His face was unfamiliar, which meant he'd arrived in the last 2 months while Calder had been up in the high country. "Calder Shaw?" the deputy asked. "Depends who's asking." "Deputy Martin Hayes. Sheriff wants a word with you." Calder's hand tightened on the package of medicine. "I'm heading back up the mountain. Don't have time for words." "Won't take long. Just a few questions about the woman you've got up there." "She's recovering. That's all you need to know." Hayes shifted his weight, one hand resting casually on his belt near where a pistol hung. "See, the thing is, we've had questions about what really happened to Mrs. Vale. Guide says one thing, but now you're saying another. Sheriff just wants to clear up the confusion." Calder stared at the deputy for a long moment, reading the situation with the same instincts he used to read weather patterns and animal behavior. Hayes was young, probably in his late 20s, new to the job, eager to prove himself, the kind of man who might mistake a mountain hermit for an easy arrest. "Your sheriff got a name?" Calder asked. "Thomas Brennan," Hayes said. "Took over 6 months back when—" Calder's world tilted. The package almost slipped from his hands. He caught it at the last second, but not before Hayes noticed the reaction. "You know him?" the deputy asked. "No," Calder said automatically. Then, because that was clearly a lie, knew of him, long time ago. But his mind was reeling. Thomas Brennan, the brave boy Lenore had taught, the boy who went to war and never came home, except apparently he had come home. And now he was the sheriff of Millbrook. "He's waiting at the jail," Hayes said. "Come on. Like I said, won't take long." Calder wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to get back on Flint and ride into the darkness before this situation became more complicated than it already was. But refusing would only create more suspicion, and suspicion would bring more questions, and questions would bring attention he absolutely didn't want. "Lead the way," Calder said. They walked down the frozen street, past windows glowing with lamplight and warmth, past people who stopped their conversations to watch the ghost of Coldwater Ridge being escorted to the jail. Calder kept his face neutral, his stride even, giving them nothing to feed their gossip. The jail was a small stone building at the end of the main street, solid construction, built to last. Hayes opened the door and gestured Calder inside. The interior was warmer than the street, but barely. A potbelly stove radiated heat in the corner. A desk sat against one wall, covered in papers and ledgers. 2 cells lined the back wall, both empty. And behind the desk sat a man Calder recognized, even though he had never seen him before. Thomas Brennan had his mother's eyes, the same deep brown, the same intensity that seemed to look straight through surface appearances to whatever truth lay beneath. But his face was harder than any schoolteacher's son should have had at his age, marked by the kind of experiences that carved permanent lines between youth and whatever came after. He looked up when Calder entered, and something flickered across his expression too quickly to name. "Mr. Shaw," Brennan said, standing. "Thank you for coming." "Didn't have much choice." Calder set the package of medicine on a nearby chair. "Your deputy made it clear it wasn't a request." Hayes can be enthusiastic, but this is just a conversation, nothing official." Brennan gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." Calder remained standing. I've got someone waiting for this medicine. Say what you need to say. Brennan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. I'm trying to piece together what happened to Lenora Vale. The guide who brought her to Millbrook says he warned her multiple times that crossing the Eastern Pass in winter was suicide. Says she insisted on going anyway, and when he refused to continue, she fired him and went on alone. That match your understanding? The guide's a liar and a thief. Can you prove that? Can he prove he's not? A faint smile touched Brennan's mouth, there and gone. That's not how the law works. Then maybe the law should work better. Calder crossed his arms. Lenora Vale collapsed at my cabin 6 days ago, half frozen and barely alive. She told me the guide took her money and abandoned her. Either she's lying and she walked away from her own money and supplies for no reason, or he robbed her and left her to die. Which sounds more likely to you? I'm inclined to believe her version, Brennan admitted. But the guide's already gone, so there's not much I can do about it now. What I need to know is whether Mrs. Vale is safe where she is. Safer than she was in that storm. But she's ill. You came down for medicine, which I'm taking back to her, tonight. In the dark? After a blizzard? Brennan shook his head. Shaw, that's a 10-hour climb in daylight on clear trails. In these conditions at night, you'll break your neck before you get halfway up. I've made that climb in worse. Maybe, but what happens if you don't make it? If you fall? If the horse goes lame? If another storm rolls in? Brennan leaned forward, his voice dropping to something more personal. Then Mrs. Vale dies alone in your cabin, and it's on both our heads. Calder said nothing, because the sheriff had a point, and they both knew it. There's a room at the boarding house, Brennan continued. Stay the night. Leave at first light. Give yourself actual visibility, and Mrs. Vale actual hope of getting that medicine. Every fiber of Calder's being wanted to refuse. He'd spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement with exactly these kinds of people. But he forced himself to think past his instincts, to calculate the real odds of making it up the mountain in darkness after a storm. They weren't good. And Lenora needed this medicine more than his pride needed protecting. One night, Calder said finally. Then I'm gone. Relief crossed Brennan's face. Thank you. I'll walk you over to Mrs. Chen's place. She runs a clean house, and she doesn't ask questions. As they headed toward the door, Calder paused. The question he'd been holding back since Hayes first spoke the sheriff's name finally forced its way out. Your mother, he said. She's still alive? Brennan turned, surprise clear on his face. You knew my mother? No, but I know someone who did. She died 4 years ago. Heart just gave out one day. Brennan's expression softened with old grief. She was a teacher, best one this territory ever had. I've heard that. They stood in the doorway, cold air rushing in from the street, two men separated by a question neither of them quite knew how to ask. Finally, Brennan spoke. The woman you're helping, Lenora Vale. You know who she is, don't you? Calder's throat tightened. Yeah, I know. She taught me everything that mattered, Brennan said quietly. Reading, writing, arithmetic, that was just the surface. She taught me that fear was normal, but courage was a choice. That the world was bigger than the horizon I could see. That... He stopped, swallowing hard. She's the reason I made it through the war. The reason I came home when a lot of good men didn't. The words hit Calder like a physical blow. He gripped the door frame to steady himself. Then I guess you understand why I'm going back up there, he managed. I do. Brennan extended his hand. Bring her down safe when she's strong enough. We'd like to see her again. Calder looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then he took it. The handshake was brief, but in it passed something wordless. An acknowledgement of shared debt, shared grief, shared understanding that some people changed your life simply by refusing to let you quit on it. Then Calder was back outside, walking through the frozen night toward a boarding house run by a woman who didn't ask questions, carrying medicine for a woman who had taught boys to be brave enough to survive wars that should have killed them, including one boy who didn't. The thought followed him into sleep that night, relentless as the wind. His son had known Lenora Vale too, had probably sat in that same classroom, learned from that same patient wisdom, been shaped by those same gentle hands, and Calder hadn't even known. There was so much he hadn't known, so much he'd never asked, so much he'd lost by choosing silence over connection. The mountain had given him isolation, but isolation had taken more than he'd realized. Tomorrow, at first light, he would climb back up to his cabin. He would bring Lenora the medicine she needed. He would keep her alive because she was the last living thread connecting him to the son he'd failed to save and the man that son had become before the war took him. But tonight, lying in an unfamiliar bed in a town he'd tried to leave behind, Calder Shaw faced a truth he'd been running from for 15 winters. You couldn't outclimb grief. You could only learn to carry it. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you found someone who helped share the weight. Dawn came gray and cold, the sun little more than a pale suggestion behind lingering clouds. Calder was already awake, had been for hours, lying in the boarding house bed and staring at the ceiling while his mind traced patterns he couldn't escape. The conversation with Sheriff Brennan had opened something he'd spent a decade trying to keep sealed. Now memories leaked through like water through a cracked dam, and all the altitude in the world couldn't stop the flood. He rose before the other boarders stirred, dressed in silence, and slipped downstairs. Mrs. Chen was already in her kitchen, a compact Chinese woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing but whose discretion was absolute. She set a plate of fried eggs and biscuits in front of him without a word, poured coffee black as midnight, and disappeared back into her cooking. Calder ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Through the window he could see Millbrook waking up, shopkeepers sweeping snow from their doorways, a blacksmith stoking his forge, children running down the street with the thoughtless energy of the young. Normal life, continuing as it always did, indifferent to the storms that raged inside individual hearts. He left coins on the table, collected his supplies from the room, and walked to the livery stable where he'd boarded Flint overnight. The stable boy, couldn't have been more than 14, looked up from mucking stalls when Calder entered. "Morning, Mr. Shaw. Your horse ate good. Gave him extra oats like you said." "Appreciate it." Calder moved to Flint's stall and began saddling the big roan, his movements practiced and efficient. "You really live up on Coldwater Ridge?" the boy asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "All alone?" "That's right." "Don't you get lonely?" Calder tightened the saddle cinch. "Loneliness is just silence you haven't made peace with yet." The boy thought about that, his young face scrunched in concentration. "That'll make sense." "It will. Give it time." Calder led Flint out of the stall and handed the boy $2 silver. "For your trouble." "That's too much." "Keep it. Buy yourself something that matters." He swung into the saddle and guided Flint out into the street. The sky had lightened fractionally, enough to see by, enough to start the climb. He was turning the horse toward the northern trail when a voice called out behind him. "Shaw, wait!" Calder turned in the saddle. Sheriff Brennan was striding down the street, his breath misting in the cold air. "Thought you might try to leave before I could catch you," Brennan said, slightly out of breath. "Told you I was going at first light." "I know, Brennan pulled something from his coat pocket. "I wanted you to give this to Mrs. Vale if she's strong enough to read." He held out a folded letter, the paper worn soft at the creases as if it had been opened and refolded many times. Calder took it carefully. "What is it?" "Something she wrote to my mother, years ago after the school burned down. My mother kept it until she died, and then I kept it." Brennan's voice roughened slightly. Mrs. Vale talked about how teaching wasn't just about passing on knowledge. It was about helping people find courage they didn't know they had. About being the voice that says, "You can do this," when everything else is screaming that you can't. Calder looked down at the letter in his gloved hand, feeling the weight of words he couldn't see. "My mother read it to me before I left for the war," Brennan continued. "I was terrified, 18 years old and convinced I wouldn't make it a week. But that letter—" He paused, gathering himself. "It reminded me that Mrs. Vale had already taught me how to be afraid and keep moving anyway. So that's what I did." "And you made it home." "I did. A lot of men didn't." Brennan's eyes held something dark and complicated. "Sometimes I wonder why. What made me different? What made me worthy of surviving when better men died?" Calder knew that question intimately, had asked it himself 10,000 times in 10,000 different ways. He carefully tucked the letter into his coat pocket. "You give her that," Brennan said. Tell her Thomas Brennan remembers everything she taught him. Tell her it mattered." "I will." Calder started to turn Flint away, then stopped. The question had been building since last night, pressing against the inside of his chest like something trying to break free. "The war," he said, not looking at Brennan. "You serve under Captain Mitchell's company? Eastern Front?" Brennan's expression shifted, surprise mixing with recognition. "I did. 3rd Infantry, attached to Mitchell's unit for the Ashford Valley campaign. How did you—" But Calder was already riding away, unable to hear whatever came next, because he'd gotten his answer, and that answer was a knife twisting in his gut. His son had served in Mitchell's company, which meant Thomas Brennan had known him, had probably fought beside him, had maybe even been there when— Calder forced the thought down and focused on the trail ahead, on the mechanical process of guiding Flint through snow that had frozen solid overnight. The climb would take most of the day. He had hours to not think about what Brennan might have told him if he'd stayed to listen. Hours to fail at not thinking about it. The trail was treacherous but navigable. Overnight cold had hardened the snow into a crust that bore weight, and Flint picked his way upward with the careful confidence of a horse that had made this climb many times before. They moved through zones of silence broken only by wind and the creak of leather and the occasional crack of ice shifting somewhere in the distance. Around midday, Calder stopped to rest at the same outcropping where he'd paused on the way down. He chewed dried meat and stared out at the valley, at Millbrook reduced to toy-sized insignificance below. He pulled out Brennan's letter. For a long moment, he just held it, feeling the weight of words written by a woman who taught children courage and a mother who passed that lesson to her son before sending him to war. Then, carefully, he unfolded it. The handwriting was precise and elegant, the product of decades spent teaching penmanship to frontier children. "Dear Catherine, I write to you not as a teacher to a parent, but as one woman to another who understands what it means to watch children grow beyond the shelter we can provide. Your Thomas is joining the army, and I know your heart must be both proud and terrified in equal measure. I want you to know that the boy you're sending to war is braver than he believes. In my classroom, I watched him transform from a child paralyzed by fear into a young man who learned that courage isn't the absence of terror, it's the decision to act despite it. He learned to speak when his voice shook, to try when failure seemed certain, to stand when falling felt easier. These are not small lessons. These are the foundations of character. War will test him in ways neither of us can imagine. He will face darkness we cannot comprehend, but he will face it with the tools we helped him build, you with your love, me with my insistence that he was capable of more than he dreamed. When the fear becomes too much, when he questions whether he can continue, he will remember that someone believed in him before he believed in himself. That belief becomes armor, not against bullets, we cannot protect them from that, but against despair. Despair is what kills the spirit long before the body falls. I have taught hundreds of children, Catherine. Most I will forget, and most will forget me. But Thomas Brennan will remember because he needed someone to see his courage before it was fully formed. And I saw it, clear as daylight, unwavering as mountains. He will come home to you. I believe this not because the world is just, but because he carries something inside him too stubborn to surrender. Hold on to that belief when the nights grow long. With deep affection and respect, Lenora Vale Calder read it twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. The old woman had been wrong about one thing. Not every soldier came home. Some of them stayed in the ground on the other side of the country, buried in graves their fathers would never visit, because visiting meant acknowledging a reality too painful to face. But she'd been right about the rest. Courage wasn't absence of fear. It was movement despite it. And everyone who survived carried the voices of people who'd believed in them before they believed in themselves. Calder's voice had been his own father, a logger who'd taught him that mountains demanded respect but rewarded persistence, that survival required learning to read the wilderness like other men read books, that a man's worth was measured not by what he said, but by what he did when everything went to hell. And his son's voice had been Lenora Vale. The realization settled over him like the cold, inescapable, and absolute. The woman dying in his cabin wasn't just a stranger he'd saved from a storm. She was the person who'd given his boy the courage to become a man. The person who'd stood in front of a classroom and taught children that they were capable of more than they believed, including the child Calder had raised but never really understood. He stood abruptly, startling Flint. They needed to keep moving. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade, and he wanted to be back at the cabin before dark. The climb resumed, harder now as exhaustion began settling into his muscles. But Calder pushed through it, driven by something more urgent than physical discomfort. He needed to tell Lenora that her words had mattered, that Thomas Brennan had come home, that the courage she'd helped him find had been enough to survive a war that killed so many others. The sun was touching the western peaks when Calder finally spotted his cabin, a dark shape against the snow, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. Lenora had kept the fire going. She was alive. Relief hit him harder than he'd expected, loosening something tight in his chest. He urged Flint up the final slope and dismounted at the door, his legs stiff from hours in the saddle. He pushed inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. Lenora was sitting up on the bench, wrapped in blankets, her face pale but alert. She looked up when he entered, and a smile broke across her features. "You made it back." "Told you I would." Calder set down the package of medicine and began removing his outer layers. "How's the fever?" "Came back this morning. Not as bad as before, but—" She gestured weakly at her flushed cheeks. "I felt better." Calder unwrapped the medicine and began preparing a dose of willow bark tea, mixing the bitter powder with hot water from the kettle on the stove. He brought it to her and watched while she drank, making sure she got it all down. "That's awful," she said, making a face. "Medicine usually is. Drink it anyway." She finished the cup and handed it back to him. "Did you have trouble in town?" "No. Well," he paused. "Met the sheriff. He wanted to ask about you." "And?" "Told him you were alive, that the guide was a liar." Calder moved to the stove and began heating more water. "He believed me." "That's good." Lenora watched him work, her expression thoughtful. "What was he like, the sheriff?" "Young, competent, fair, I think." Calder reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. "His name is Thomas Brennan." He heard Lenora's sharp intake of breath behind him. "Thomas?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "But I thought... They said he died in the war." "A lot of people said a lot of things. Turns out he made it home." Calder turned and held out the letter. "He asked me to give you this." Lenora took it with trembling hands. She stared at the familiar handwriting, her own, from years ago, and tears began sliding down her weathered cheeks. "He kept it," she whispered. "All this time, he kept it. His mother did first, then he did after she passed." Calder sat down in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "He said to tell you he remembers everything you taught him, said it mattered." Lenora pressed the letter to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Calder looked away, giving her privacy for grief and joy too tangled to separate. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled. The cabin settled into its familiar sounds. Finally, Lenora spoke. "I need to tell you something." "You should rest. Medicine needs time to work." "This can't wait." She carefully refolded the letter and set it on the bench beside her. "When I collapsed at your door, I wasn't just running from the storm. I was running from the truth about why I was really trying to reach my daughter." Calder waited. "The fire that took my school," Lenora continued, her voice steady despite the tears still tracking down her face. "It wasn't an accident. They never proved it, but I knew. There was a man in town, Jacob Morse, who wanted the land, said education was wasted on frontier children, that they'd be better off working trades and building the territory. We'd fought about it for years. And you think he burned it down?" "I know he did. I saw him the night before standing across the street, just watching the building, like he was saying goodbye to an obstacle." Her hands clenched in the blanket. "But I couldn't prove it. And when I tried to rebuild, to start again, he made sure no one would sell me property. No one would donate materials. The town council, half of them in his pocket, voted to allocate the education budget elsewhere." "So you left?" "I ran," Lenora corrected bitterly. "I told myself I was going to visit my daughter, to meet my grandson. to start fresh somewhere new. But the truth is, I was abandoning the fight, letting Morse win because I was too tired to keep fighting. She looked up at Calder, her eyes fierce despite their redness. And then I nearly died on your mountain, and you, a man who had every reason to turn me away, you saved me instead. You came down from your isolation, went into a town you clearly hate, put yourself through questions and suspicion, all to get medicine for a stranger. Her voice broke. Why? Calder was quiet for a long moment. Outside, darkness had fully settled, the world beyond the windows reduced to formless black. You want the truth? He asked finally. Please. Because I know what it's like to run. The words came slowly, painfully, like drawing splinters from a wound. 15 years ago, I had a son. Good boy, smart, brave, everything a father could want. When the war started, he wanted to enlist. Was so sure it was the right thing, the noble thing. He stopped, staring into the fire. I told him he was a fool. That the war was politics and politicians, and boys like him would be the ones to bleed for it. We fought about it for weeks. Terrible things were said, things I wish I could take back. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. He enlisted anyway, didn't even tell me until he was already gone. Lenora made a soft sound of understanding. I got one letter from him, just one. Said he was scared but ready. Said he hoped he'd make me proud. Calder's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. I never wrote back. I was too angry, too stubborn, too convinced that he'd come crawling home when he realized I was right. Oh, Calder. 3 months later, a soldier came to the door. Official notification of death in combat. They didn't even send the body home. Mass grave somewhere in Virginia, mixed with 100 other boys who died the same day. He finally looked at Lenora. I never got to tell him I was wrong. Never got to say I was proud of him anyway. Never got to say any of the things that mattered. So you came up here. So I ran up here, Calder corrected, echoing her earlier words. Built this cabin as far from the world as I could get. Told myself I was choosing solitude, but really I was just hiding from the fact that my pride cost me my son. The silence that followed felt different from the one they'd shared before, not uncomfortable but weighted with mutual recognition. Two people who'd run from different failures into different wildernesses, only to be thrown together by a storm that refused to let them keep hiding. What was his name? Lenore asked softly. Calder's throat worked. He hadn't spoken the name aloud in 15 years. But something about this moment, this woman, this cabin at the top of the world demanded the truth. Daniel, he said. Daniel Shaw. Lenore's face went very still. What company did he serve with? 3rd Infantry. Under Captain Mitchell. Eastern Front? Ashford Valley Campaign. Calder's heart began to hammer. How do you know that? Instead of answering, Lenora reached for her traveling bag, the one Calder had set beside the bench when he first brought her in from the storm. Her hands shook as she unbuckled it and began pulling out items. A change of clothes, a small Bible, a packet of letters tied with string. She pulled one letter free from the bundle and held it out to him. I think, she said, her voice trembling, you need to read this. Calder took it like it might burn him. The envelope was addressed to Lenora Vale in handwriting he didn't recognize. The postmark was dated 4 years ago, 1 year after Daniel's death. He opened it and began to read. Dear Mrs. Vale, you don't know me, but you taught my best friend. His name was Daniel Shaw. He died 6 months ago in a battle near a place called Ashford Valley, and I'm writing because he asked me to if anything happened to him. Daniel talked about you often, said you were his teacher back when he was just a scared kid who couldn't read in front of the class without stammering. Said you spent extra hours with him, teaching him that being afraid of words was the same as being afraid of anything else. It only had power if you let it. He said you taught him that courage wasn't about being the loudest or the bravest. It was about being the person who kept going even when everything in you screamed to quit. That lesson saved his life more than once out here, Mrs. Vale. And it saved mine, too, because Daniel pulled me out of a burning building during the siege at Richmond. Took a bullet doing it. Nothing fatal, but enough that they sent him home for recovery. He should have stayed there, should have taken the discharge they offered. But he came back. Said he couldn't leave the rest of us behind. 3 weeks later, Ashford Valley happened. We were outnumbered 5-1, ammunition running low, retreat cut off. Daniel held the line when it would have been easier to run. He covered our withdrawal, bought us time to regroup. 7 men got out because of what he did. I was one of them. He took 3 shots in the final push. I was there when he went down. He knew it was bad. But you know what he said to me? He said, "Tell my father I wasn't running anymore." Those were his last words. I don't know what he meant by that, but I'm hoping you do. I'm hoping you can find his father and tell him that his son died a hero, that Daniel Shaw saved lives by giving his own, that every lesson you taught him about courage and persistence and not quitting when things got hard, all of it mattered. It mattered more than you'll ever know. He asked me to tell you thank you for seeing something in him before he saw it in himself, for being the voice that said he could do it when he didn't believe he could. So thank you, Mrs. Vale. From all of us Daniel saved, from the boy you taught who became the man who taught us. Respectfully, Corporal Marcus Webb, 3rd Infantry, Mitchell's Company. The letter fell from Calder's hands. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The cabin walls pressed in and the air turned to stone in his lungs, and the world collapsed into a single truth he'd been running from for 15 years. His son hadn't died hating him. Daniel had carried those last terrible words between them all the way to war, all the way through battles and blood and terror, and in his final moments he'd been thinking about his father. Tell my father I wasn't running anymore. Because Daniel had understood what Calder was only now beginning to grasp, that both of them had been running. The son from the father's anger, the father from the pain of watching his child walk into danger, both of them too proud, too hurt, too convinced they were right to see that love had been there all along, buried under stubbornness and fear. And Lenora Vale had been there too. 15 years ago, teaching a scared boy to read without stammering, teaching him that courage was just fear that kept moving, teaching him the lessons that would eventually save 7 men's lives at the cost of his own. I tried to find you, Lenora whispered, after I got that letter. I asked everyone in town if they knew where Daniel Shaw's father had gone, but you'd vanished. Everyone said the ghost of Coldwater Ridge was just a story, a legend, not a real person. I was real, Calder said, his voice cracked and raw. Just too much of a coward to let anyone find me. You're not a coward. You're a father who lost his son and didn't know how to survive the grief. I survived by running away, by hiding up here where the pain couldn't reach me. He looked at her, this frail old woman who'd traveled across a territory in winter just to find him and deliver words his son had died trying to send. But you didn't run. You kept trying to find me. Even after the fire, even after Morse destroyed your school, even after everything, you were still trying to do the right thing. The right thing, Lenore repeated bitterly. I was trying to reach my daughter because I'd given up on everything else. If that storm hadn't forced me to your door, I'd have just kept running in a different direction. But it did force you here. Calder picked up the letter with trembling hands. You collapsed at my door carrying words I've needed to hear for 15 years. That's not coincidence, that's... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Because what was it? Fate? Providence? The mountain's way of forcing 2 broken people into the same space until they had no choice but to face the truths they'd been fleeing. Whatever it was, it had brought them here, to this cabin, to this moment, to the realization that the stranger he'd saved wasn't a stranger at all, but the last living connection to the son he'd lost, and the courage that son had carried to his death. Lenore was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face. He was so proud of you, Calder. Even when he talked about your fights, about the anger between you, underneath it all was this desperate need to make you proud of him. Everything he did, every risk he took, every time he chose courage over safety, he was trying to become the man he thought you wanted him to be. I already was proud of him, Calder said, the words breaking on their way out. I just never told him. I was too busy being right to tell him the truth. They sat in the firelight, 2 people who'd spent years running from pain they couldn't outrun, finally forced to stop and face what they'd been fleeing. Outside, the wind had died. The mountain settled into the deep, cold silence that came after storms. And inside the cabin, something that had been frozen for 15 years began slowly and painfully to thaw. I need to go back, Lenora said finally. Calder looked up. To your daughters? To Millbrook. Her voice strengthened. To rebuild the school, to fight Morse and the council and everyone who thinks education doesn't matter. Because it does matter, Calder. Your son proved that. Thomas Brennan proved it. Every child I ever taught who went on to do something brave, something good, something that made the world a little less dark, they all proved it. You're still sick. The journey? I'll get better. You'll make sure of that. She met his eyes. And when I'm strong enough, you're going to take me down that mountain, not to run away, to go back and fight. Calder wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it was too dangerous, too foolish, that Jacob Morse and men like him always won in the end because they were willing to do things decent people wouldn't. But he looked at this fragile woman who'd survived a blizzard and a fever and 15 years of carrying a letter meant for a ghost, and he knew she was right. Running didn't solve anything. It just delayed the reckoning. Then I'll take you, he said. When you're ready, we'll go back together. Lenora smiled, and for the first time since she'd collapsed at his door, Calder saw the teacher she must have been. The woman who'd stood in front of classrooms full of frightened children and taught them they were capable of more than they believed. That night, after Lenora had fallen into a healing sleep and the cabin had grown quiet except for the crackle of fire and the settling of logs, Calder sat at his table with 2 letters in front of him. The one Lenora had written to Thomas Brennan's mother about courage being movement despite fear. The one Marcus Webb had written about Daniel Shaw's final words. He read them both again, slowly, letting the words settle into places that had been hollow for too long. Then he did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He pulled out paper and pen and began to write. Dear Daniel, I know you can't read this. I know you're gone, and these words will never reach you, but I need to say them anyway, even if I'm just saying them to silence and snow and the mountain that's been my prison for too long. You were right about the war, about courage, about everything that mattered, and I was wrong. Wrong to fight you, wrong to let you leave angry, wrong to think that protecting you meant keeping you small and safe instead of letting you grow into the man you were meant to be. Mrs. Vale taught you well. She taught you that fear was normal, but courage was a choice. That being brave meant moving forward even when everything screamed at you to quit. I should have taught you that too. Instead, I taught you that admitting fear was weakness, that asking for help meant failure, that the only strength worth having was the kind that needed no one. I was wrong about that too. You saved 7 men before you died. You held the line when running would have been easier. You made the choice to go back when you could have stayed home. That's not the boy I knew. That's the man you became. And I'm so damn proud of you I can barely breathe. I love you, Daniel. I should have said it more. Should have said it when it mattered. Should have said it the last time I saw you instead of words we both regretted. But I'm saying it now. I love you. And I'm not running anymore either. Your father Calder folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, next to his heart. Tomorrow he would begin helping Lenora heal. And when she was strong enough, they would descend from this mountain together. Not to run, but to return. To fight the battles they'd been avoiding. To honor the people who'd taught them courage. To prove that the lessons mattered. Because 15 years ago, a teacher had told a stammering boy that words only had power if you let them. And that boy had carried those words all the way to war, all the way to his death, all the way into a courage that saved lives and changed the world in ways too small for history books, but too important to forget. The mountain had given Calder silence. But silence wasn't peace. It was just fear in a different form. Real peace required facing what you'd run from. And Calder Shaw was finally ready to stop running. The days that followed moved with the strange rhythm of mountain time, slow and relentless, each one bleeding into the next with barely perceptible progress. Lenora's recovery was not a straight line, but a series of advances and retreats, her body fighting a battle against exhaustion and exposure that medicine could only partially address. Calder became a healer by necessity, learning through trial and observation what worked and what didn't. He brewed willow bark tea 3 times daily, forcing it down her throat even when she protested the bitterness. He kept the cabin warm but not stifling, fed the fire with a precision that maintained steady heat without wasting wood. He made broths from dried venison and wild herbs he'd gathered the previous autumn, coaxing her to eat even when she had no appetite. And slowly, grudgingly, her body began to mend. On the 5th day after his return from Millbrook, Lenora was strong enough to sit up without assistance. On the 7th, she could stand and walk the short distance from the bench to the table. By the 10th day, color had returned to her face, and the cough that had rattled her chest began to loosen its grip. They fell into an unspoken routine during those days. Mornings, Calder would go out to check his trap lines and gather firewood, giving Lenora privacy and quiet. Afternoons, they would share the cabin's small space, Calder working on maintaining his equipment, Lenora reading from the few books he kept on the shelf, or simply watching the snow through the window with the patience of someone who'd learned that healing couldn't be rushed. Evenings were different. As twilight settled over the mountain and the fire cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls, they began to talk. Not the surface conversations of strangers making polite noise, but the deeper exchanges of two people who'd already seen each other's broken places and had nothing left to hide. Lenora told him about her years teaching in frontier schools, moving from settlement to settlement as populations shifted and opportunities arose. She spoke of children who'd arrived barely able to spell their own names and left ready to face whatever the territory threw at them. She described the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a student's eyes, the moment when confusion crystallized into clarity. Teaching was never just about reading and arithmetic, she said one evening, her voice soft in the firelight. It was about showing children that they were capable of more than their circumstances suggested, that poverty didn't mean stupidity, that being born in a place without libraries didn't mean they couldn't learn to love words. Daniel loved words, Calder said. He'd found it easier to speak his son's name as the days passed, each utterance loosening the grip of silence he'd maintained for so long. Used to read everything he could get his hands on. Books, newspapers, labels on tin cans. Drove me crazy sometimes, the way he'd stop in the middle of work to sound out some word he didn't know. Did you teach him to read? His mother did, before she passed. Fever took her when Daniel was 8. The old grief was still there, but duller now, worn smooth by time. After that, it was just me and him. I taught him to trap, to track, to survive in the mountains. She taught him everything else that mattered. Lenora smiled faintly. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was, patient in ways I never learned to be. She understood that teaching required meeting people where they were, not demanding they come to you. Calder stared into the fire. I never figured that out. Just expected Daniel to understand what I meant without me having to explain. Expected him to know I loved him even though I never said it. But he did know. The letter Marcus Webb wrote made that clear. Knowing and hearing are different things. Calder's voice roughened. A boy shouldn't have to guess whether his father's proud of him, shouldn't have to go to war carrying that uncertainty. No, Lenora agreed quietly. He shouldn't, but Calder, listen to me. She waited until he met her eyes. Daniel went to war knowing you loved him, even if the words weren't spoken. Love isn't just words. It's every hour you spent teaching him to survive, every meal you put on the table, every time you were there when he needed you, even when you didn't know how to talk about what mattered. And the times I wasn't there? The time I let him leave angry? Those count too. They're part of the whole picture. You can't cherry-pick the moments that define a relationship and discard the rest. She leaned forward slightly. Your son knew you well enough to understand that your anger came from fear. Fear of losing him. Fear of the world taking him the way it had already taken so much else. That's love too, even when it manifests as something that looks like its opposite. Calder wanted to believe her, but 15 years of guilt had carved channels in his thinking that weren't easily redirected. How do you do it? He asked. Keep believing that things matter, that teaching mattered, that the school mattered, that any of it made a difference when Morse could just burn it all down and walk away clean. Because the alternative is accepting that cruelty wins, that people like Morse get to define what's valuable and what isn't. Lenora's eyes hardened. I won't give him that power, not over my past and certainly not over my future. You really mean to go back, to rebuild? I do. It won't be easy. Morse has money, influence. The town council listens to men like him. Then I'll make them listen to me instead. There was steel in her voice now, the iron will that must have sustained her through decades of frontier teaching. I've spent too long running from that fight. You helped me see that. When you came down from this mountain to get medicine for a stranger, You showed me what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I learned that from you, Calder said, through Daniel, through what you taught him. Then we learned it from each other, passed through a boy who became a bridge between two people who needed the same lesson. She smiled, sad and wise. Maybe that's what teaching really is. Not a one-way transfer of knowledge, but a circle that keeps expanding until it touches lives the original teacher never even knew existed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not a storm, but the steady push of air moving across the high peaks, the mountain's constant breath. Finally, Calder spoke. When we go down, you'll need support. People who'll stand with you against Morse and his council cronies. I know, I've been thinking about that. Thomas Brennan will help. He's sheriff now, that carries weight. It does. But I'll need more than law enforcement. I'll need parents willing to fight for their children's education, community members willing to donate time and materials, maybe even some of my former students, if I can find them. There's also the matter of property. You said Morse blocked you from buying land before. What makes you think it'll be different this time? Lenora's expression turned calculating. Because this time I won't ask permission. There's homestead land outside town limits, technically federal territory, not under council jurisdiction. If I can file a proper claim, build on it before Morse realizes what's happening, that's risky. Homestead claims require improvements, residence, time. You'd be exposed while you're establishing legitimacy. I know. That's why I'll need help. She looked at him directly. Your help specifically. Calder felt something shift in his chest, part resistance, part recognition of the inevitable. I'm not a builder. Not on that scale. You built this cabin. By yourself, in one of the harshest environments in the territory. If you can do that, you can help me build a schoolhouse. That's different. This was for me, alone. A school is for everyone, Lenora finished. For the community. For children who need someone to believe they're capable of more than survival. She paused. For Daniel's memory. The words landed like a physical blow. Calder stood abruptly, crossed to the window, stared out at darkness so complete it was like looking into the void itself. That's not fair, he said quietly. No, it's not. But it's true. Lenora's voice was gentle but unyielding. Your son died believing in something. Believing that some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. Are you going to honor that by hiding up here for another 15 years? Or are you going to come down from this mountain and help build something that makes his sacrifice mean something? Calder's hands clenched on the windowsill. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to protect the isolation he'd built so carefully, to maintain the walls that kept the world at a safe distance. But Lenora was right. Daniel had died fighting for something he believed in, and Calder had spent 15 years running from that reality, hiding from the implications of his son's courage. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to fight for something too. He turned from the window. If we do this, we do it right. Proper foundation, solid walls, roof that'll hold through winter storms, no shortcuts. Lenora's face lit up with something that looked like joy mixed with relief. No shortcuts, she agreed. And we'll need a plan. Can't just march into town and start hammering boards together. Morse will shut us down before we get the frame up. Then we'll be smart about it. File the homestead claim quietly. Gather materials slowly. Build support before we break ground. She was already thinking ahead, her mind moving through logistics with the efficiency of someone who'd organized countless school years. We'll need allies, people we can trust. Brennan, Calder said. He'll help. Probably knows who else in town might stand with us. What about Carson, the man who runs the general store? He'll sell us supplies if we pay. Don't know if he'll do more than that. We'll find out. And there's Mrs. Chen, the boarding house owner. She strikes me as someone who doesn't suffer fools. They talked late into the night, sketching out the bones of a plan that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. By the time Lenora's exhaustion caught up with her and she settled down to sleep, they'd outlined a strategy that would require timing, discretion, and more courage than either of them felt certain they possessed. But they had something else too. They had purpose. For the first time in 15 years, Calder Shaw had a reason to come down from the mountain that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with building something that might outlast him. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Calder went out early to check his traps and found the temperature had dropped overnight into the range that made exposed skin dangerous within minutes. He worked quickly, resetting snares and collecting 2 marten pelts, then returned to the cabin to find Lenora already awake and moving around with increasing steadiness. "I think I'm ready," she said. Calder hung his coat on the peg by the door. "Ready for what?" "To try the walk. You've been keeping me cooped up in here for almost 2 weeks. I need to know if my legs will hold when we start down." "It's too cold. Wait until it warms up." "It's not going to warm up. This is a mountain in winter. It's only going to get colder." She was already pulling on the extra layers he'd given her, wrapping herself in wool and fur until she looked twice her actual size. "I need to do this, Calder. I need to know I can." He understood that need, the requirement to test yourself against the thing you feared, to prove you were capable before the moment arrived when capability was required rather than optional. "Fine, but we stay close to the cabin. First sign you're struggling, we turn back." They stepped out into air so cold it burned going down. Lenora gasped at the shock of it, then forced herself to breathe normally, taking measured inhales through her nose the way Calder had taught her. The world outside was white and still, the recent storms having buried everything under fresh snow that sparkled in the weak sunlight like scattered diamonds. Calder led the way, breaking trail in a wide circle around the cabin, while Lenora followed in his footsteps, her breathing labored but steady. They made it perhaps 100 yards before she had to stop, one hand pressed to her side, her face flushed with exertion. "This is harder than I expected," she admitted between breaths. "You nearly died 2 weeks ago. Give yourself time." "Time is exactly what I don't have. Spring is coming, and with it the window to build before next winter." "Spring's 3 months away minimum. That's plenty of time to get your strength back." They continued the circuit, Lenora pushing herself harder than Calder thought was wise, but not hard enough to cause real damage. By the time they returned to the cabin's door, she was trembling with exhaustion, but also glowing with satisfaction. "I did it," she said, sinking onto the bench inside, while Calder fed the fire back to life. "It hurt like hell, but I did it." "You did. Tomorrow we'll go a little farther. Tomorrow I might not be able to move. Then we'll wait until you can. Healing isn't a race." But even as he said it, Calder knew they were both feeling the pressure of time passing. The mountain winter would hold for months yet, but eventually the snow would begin to melt and the trails would open and the opportunity to act would arrive whether they were ready or not. They needed to be ready. Over the following days, Calder pushed Lenora's recovery with the same relentless patience he'd once used teaching Daniel to track deer through deep snow. Short walks became longer ones. Rests became briefer. He taught her to read the mountain's moods, the quality of light that preceded storms, the wind patterns that signaled changing weather, the small signs that meant the difference between safe passage and deadly miscalculation. And Lenora, in turn, taught him things he hadn't realized he needed to learn. She talked about building community, about the delicate work of bringing people together around shared purpose. She explained how to read a town's power structures, to identify who actually made decisions versus who just made noise. She shared strategies for handling opposition, when to confront directly, when to maneuver around obstacles, when to wait for the right moment rather than forcing issues prematurely. "Morse is going to be a problem," she said one afternoon while they were preparing dinner. "He's the kind of man who sees opposition as personal insult. He won't just disagree with the school, he'll see it as an attack on his authority. Then we'll have to be smarter than him." "Being smart isn't enough. We'll have to be strategic." She stirred the pot thoughtfully. "When I fought him before, I made the mistake of being righteous. I assumed that being right would be sufficient, that the community would naturally support education over greed. But they didn't. No, because Morse offered them something I didn't: economic development, jobs, growth. He positioned the school as an obstacle to progress rather than a contributor to it. And people listened because they were struggling, and struggling people will often choose immediate relief over long-term investment. So how do we counter that this time? By making the school part of the economic argument. We don't just appeal to people's better nature, We show them how education strengthens the entire community, how literate workers are more valuable workers, how educated children become adults who build businesses and create opportunities. Calder was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. That's not how I think. I see the school as about learning, not economics. It's about both. Everything's connected, Calder. You can't separate education from economy, or community from survival, or individual good from collective benefit. That's the mistake I made before, treating the school as if it existed in isolation from everything else. She looked at him seriously. We won't make that mistake again. The confidence in her voice was something new, or perhaps something old that had been buried under years of defeat and was only now resurging. Calder recognized it as the same quality that had made her an effective teacher, the ability to see beyond immediate obstacles to larger patterns and possibilities. On the 17th day after Calder's trip to Millbrook, they made a discovery that changed everything. Calder was in the lean-to, checking Flint's hooves for ice buildup, when he heard Lenore call out from inside the cabin. Her voice carried an urgency that had him moving before he'd consciously decided to respond. He found her standing at the table, one of his old maps spread out in front of her. The map showed the territory around Millbrook in rough detail, hand-drawn from memory and observation over years of living in the high country. "Look at this," Lenora said, pointing to a spot on the map just north of where Millbrook's borders were marked. "Is this accurate? Is there really a creek running through here?" Calder leaned over her shoulder, studying the lines he'd drawn years ago. "Yeah, Coldwater Creek. Comes down from the ridge, cuts through the valley before joining the main river south of town. And this area here?" She traced her finger across a section marked as open land. "This is outside town jurisdiction? Federal territory. Why?" Lenora's eyes were bright with excitement. "Because I just remembered something. The original town charter specified that municipal boundaries extended to the northern bank of Coldwater Creek, which means everything on the southern bank is still federal land, available for homestead claims. We already talked about homesteading. That's the plan." "Yes, but look where the creek runs." She tapped the map insistently. "It's less than half a mile from town center, close enough to be accessible for students, far enough to be outside Morse's direct control. And there's something else. Do you see this bend in the creek?" Calder looked closer. The map showed Coldwater Creek making a sharp curve, creating a small peninsula of high ground surrounded on three sides by water. "That's defensible," Lenora continued. "Natural boundaries on three sides, only one approach by land. If we build there, it'd be difficult for anyone to interfere with construction without making their intentions very obvious." "You're thinking tactically, like this is a military operation." "Isn't it? We're going up against entrenched opposition with superior resources. We need every advantage we can get." She studied the map with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. How long would it take to get materials to that location? From town? Maybe an hour with a loaded wagon, assuming the ground's frozen hard enough to bear weight. Why? "Because I'm thinking we don't announce our intentions until we're already building. We file the homestead claim through proper channels. That's public record, can't hide it. But we file for more land than we actually need, spread across several parcels. Morse will investigate eventually, but if we're smart about the paperwork, he won't know which parcel we're actually planning to use until we've already started construction." Calder felt a reluctant admiration building. "That's devious. That's survival. Morse taught me that lesson when he burned down my school. He didn't announce his intentions. He just acted when he thought I was vulnerable. This time, I'm going to be the one who acts first." They spent the rest of the afternoon refining the plan, adding details and contingencies until they had something that felt almost possible. They would wait until early spring, when the ground thawed enough for construction, but weather remained unpredictable enough to keep casual observers away. They would gather materials slowly through the winter, storing them in locations that wouldn't draw attention. They would recruit help quietly, one person at a time, building a network of support before Morse realized what was happening. And then, when the moment was right, they would move fast. "How long do you think we have before Morse realizes and tries to stop us?" Lenora asked as they rolled up the map. "Depends how good our operational security is. If word gets out early, maybe days. If we're careful, could be weeks." "Weeks isn't enough to finish a building." "No, but it might be enough to establish undeniable progress. Get the foundation laid, walls framed, roof partially up. Make it clear we're serious and committed. And then what? When he comes with the council, with legal arguments and political pressure, then we stand our ground. Calder met her eyes. We make him choose between backing down or escalating to violence. And if he chooses violence, we make sure everyone in Millbrook sees exactly who started it. Lenora nodded slowly. You've thought about this before. About how to handle confrontation. 15 years alone on a mountain gives you time to think about a lot of things, including what you'd do differently if you ever got a second chance. Is that what this is for you? A second chance? The question hung in the air between them. Calder turned away, moving to the window, looking out at the endless white expanse that had been his refuge and his prison for so long. Daniel died fighting for something he believed in, he said finally. I couldn't fight alongside him then, couldn't support him the way he needed, but maybe... He stopped, the words catching. Maybe I can fight for his memory now, for the idea that education matters, that teaching matters, that the lessons people like you gave to kids like him actually changed the world. They did change the world, Calder. Daniel proved that. Thomas Brennan proved it. Every student I ever taught who went on to do something brave or kind or important, they all proved it. Then let's prove it again. He turned back to face her. Let's build something that lasts longer than both of us. Something that gives other kids what you gave Daniel and Thomas, the belief that they're capable of more than they think. Lenora crossed to where he stood and took his weathered hands in her frail ones. We're really going to do this. We're really going to do this. They stood like that for a moment, an old woman and a mountain man, both of them scarred by loss and failure, both of them choosing to try again anyway. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. The space that had felt like a tomb for 15 years now felt like the staging ground for something new. That night, after Lenora had gone to sleep, Calder pulled out the letter he'd written to Daniel weeks earlier. He read it again by firelight, the words still raw and painful but necessary. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept the few things that mattered: his father's pocket watch, a lock of his wife's hair, the deed to his cabin. Someday maybe he'd find a way to leave that letter somewhere it belonged, on a grave he'd never visited, in a place that honored the fallen. But for now, it was enough to have written it, enough to have said the words, even if only to silence and firelight, enough to know that he was finally ready to stop hiding from the truth of his son's courage and his own failure to match it. The mountain had taught him survival. Lenora was teaching him something more important: how to live with purpose instead of just existing in the spaces between storms, how to honor the dead by fighting for the living, how to build instead of hiding. And as he sat in his cabin at the top of the world, listening to an old woman's steady breathing and the wind's eternal conversation with the peaks, Calder Shaw felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope that things would somehow magically get better, but the harder, more durable hope that came from deciding to make them better yourself. One board at a time, one student at a time, one choice at a time to move forward instead of running away. The mountain would still be here tomorrow, indifferent and eternal, but Calder Shaw wouldn't be hiding from it anymore. He'd be using it as a foundation to build something that mattered, something his son would have been proud of, something worth coming down from the heights to fight for. The fire burned low, and Calder let it. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it another day of preparation, another step toward the confrontation they both knew was inevitable. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of a cabin that had witnessed too much solitude, two people who'd found each other by accident were choosing to face the future by design. And that was enough. 3 weeks later, the mountain finally released its grip. The change came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The brutal cold that had locked the high country in frozen stasis began to ease. Daytime temperatures climbed above freezing for a few precious hours before plunging again at night. Ice that had hung from the cabin's eaves for months started to drip and crack. The snow's surface, which had been hard as stone, developed a soft crust that crunched differently under Calder's boots. Spring was still months away, but winter had begun its slow retreat. Lenora's recovery had followed a similar trajectory. Gradual, but undeniable. The fever hadn't returned. The cough had faded to an occasional clearing of the throat. She could walk the perimeter of the cabin without stopping to rest, could help with simple tasks without exhaustion claiming her immediately after. She was ready. They both knew it. On a morning when pale sunlight made the snow shimmer like crushed glass, Calder began packing for the descent. He worked methodically, distributing supplies between his own pack and the saddlebags on Flint, calculating weight and balance with the precision of someone who'd learned that carelessness in the mountains was just another word for death. Lenora watched from the doorway, already dressed in the layers they'd prepared for the journey. "Are you going to miss it?" she asked. "The cabin, the solitude?" Calder secured a rope around a bundle of pelts, his trading goods, the currency that would help fund what came next. "Parts of it." "Which parts?" "The quiet, the simplicity, knowing exactly what each day would bring." He glanced at her. "The safety of not caring about anything except survival." "But you did care. That's why you let me in." "I let you in because the storm forced my hand." "No." Lenora stepped down into the snow, her breath misting in the cold air. "You let me in because somewhere under all that isolation, you were still human, still capable of choosing compassion over convenience." She paused. "Still Daniel's father." The name landed softly, but with weight. Calder had grown more comfortable speaking it over the past weeks, but hearing it still caused a small ache in his chest, the kind that comes from touching a healing wound to remind yourself it's real. "Daniel would have let you in without hesitation," Calder said. "Would have given you his own bed and slept on the floor. Would have ridden down for medicine without being asked." "Maybe. But Daniel learned that generosity somewhere. From someone." Lenora met his eyes. "Children don't spontaneously generate compassion. They learn it by watching the adults in their lives." Calder wanted to argue, to point out all the ways he'd failed as a father, all the silences where words should have been. But Lenora's expression stopped him, not challenging, just certain. A teacher who'd spent decades observing how children absorbed the world around them and who knew things about human nature that hermits who fled to mountains didn't want to acknowledge. He returned to packing without responding, but the words settled into him anyway, finding spaces he hadn't known were hollow. By mid-morning, they were ready. Calder took a final walk through the cabin, banking the fire so it wouldn't die completely, securing the shutters, making sure everything was protected against the weather that would surely come in his absence. He didn't know how long he'd be gone. Days, certainly. Possibly weeks, depending on how things developed in Millbrook. The cabin would wait. It always had. He stepped outside and found Lenora standing beside Flint, one hand resting on the horse's massive shoulder, her face tilted toward the peaks that rose above them like frozen waves. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me time to heal, for not giving up on me when it would have been easier to let the mountain take me. The mountain doesn't get everything it wants." Calder swung into the saddle, then reached down. "Come on, long way down, and I want to make it before dark." Lenora took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. She settled into position, her arms wrapping around his waist for stability, and Calder felt the strange vulnerability of having another person's safety depending directly on his choices. He'd forgotten what that felt like, the weight of responsibility that came with connection. He'd forgotten a lot of things during his years of self-imposed exile. They started down the trail, Flint picking his way carefully through snow that had begun to soften in the midday sun. The descent required concentration, ice hidden beneath seemingly solid surfaces, rocks made treacherous by meltwater refreezing overnight, sections where the trail had simply vanished under drifts that would have to be navigated by memory and instinct. Calder had made this journey countless times, but never with a passenger. Never with someone whose life depended on him making the right decisions at every turn. The awareness sharpened his focus, made him see the familiar trail with fresh eyes. They stopped twice to rest, once at the outcropping where Calder had paused on previous trips, and again at a sheltered spot where ancient pines created a natural windbreak. Each time Lenora dismounted carefully, moving with the deliberate caution of someone who knew her body's limits but was determined to push past them anyway. "How are you holding up?" Calder asked during the second stop, watching as she stretched her back and rolled her shoulders. "Better than I expected, worse than I'd like." She smiled slightly, "but still moving forward, which is what matters. We can take more time if you need it." I don't need it. I just need to get down to Millbrook and start making this happen before I lose my nerve. You're not going to lose your nerve. How do you know? Because you survived a blizzard that should have killed you, then told a mountain hermit you were going back down to fight the man who destroyed your life's work. That's not the behavior of someone who loses their nerve. Lenora laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as him. When you put it that way, I suppose I do sound moderately insane. Most brave people do. Calder checked the sky, gauging the remaining daylight. We should keep moving. Want to make the valley before sunset. They remounted and continued down. As the altitude dropped, the landscape began to change. The sparse, wind-tortured trees of the high country gave way to denser forest. Snow became patchier, revealing brown earth and dead grass underneath. The air grew fractionally warmer, easier to breathe. And in the distance, Millbrook began to emerge from the valley floor like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. They reached the outskirts of town as the sun touched the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. Calder guided Flint down the main street at a deliberate walk, very aware of the attention they were drawing. People stopped their evening routines to stare, some recognizing the mountain man who rarely descended, others curious about the woman riding behind him. Lenora Vale had been presumed dead by most of the town. Her return would cause talk. Good, Calder thought. Let them talk. Talk meant attention, and attention made it harder for Morse to operate in shadows. He stopped in front of Mrs. Chen's boarding house and helped Lenora dismount. She stood on solid ground for the first time in hours, swaying slightly before finding her balance. The boarding house door opened before they could knock. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Mr. Shaw, Mrs. Vale. Her sharp eyes moved between them, taking in everything. Lenora's obvious exhaustion, Calder's protective stance, the way they'd arrived together as the sun set. I have rooms available. 2 rooms, Calder said, and we'll need them for a while. Mrs. Chen stepped aside to let them enter. The sheriff came by earlier, said if you showed up, I should send word. I'll go to him after we're settled. Not tonight, you won't. Mrs. Chen's voice carried the authority of someone who didn't make suggestions so much as state realities. You both look half dead. Eat, sleep, then deal with the sheriff in the morning when you're capable of thinking clearly. Calder started to argue, then realized she was right. Exhaustion had settled into his bones during the long descent, and Lenora looked ready to collapse where she stood. 2 rooms, he repeated, and dinner if you have it. Always have dinner. This is a boarding house, not a stable. But there was something that might have been warmth in Mrs. Chen's voice as she led them upstairs. Good to see you made it down alive, Mrs. Vale. Town's been wondering. I'm sure they have. Lenora managed a tired smile. And I'm sure the stories have been colorful. You have no idea. Mrs. Chen stopped at 2 adjacent doors. These are yours. Dinner in an hour. Don't be late. She departed down the hallway, leaving them standing in the dim corridor. Calder opened the door to one room, checking to make sure it was secure and adequate. Clean bed, functional stove, window that locked. It would do. Thank you, Lenora said from her doorway. For everything, for the mountain, for the descent, for not giving up on this insane plan we've created. I haven't done anything yet except get you down safely. The hard part starts tomorrow. I know, but still. She touched his arm briefly. Thank you. She slipped into her room and closed the door. Calder stood in the hallway for a moment, feeling the weight of what they were about to attempt settling over him like snow accumulating on a roof. Inevitable, potentially dangerous, but necessary if the structure underneath was going to serve its purpose. He went to his own room and began unpacking, moving through the familiar ritual of organizing gear and planning next steps. But his mind kept drifting to the conversation that awaited him with Sheriff Brennan, the man who'd served alongside Daniel, who'd survived the same battles that killed his son, who knew things about Daniel's final days that Calder had never asked about because asking meant confronting truths he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Maybe it was time to stop avoiding them. Dinner was a quiet affair. Mrs. Chen's cooking supplemented by the presence of 3 other boarders who ate in studious silence, clearly aware that something significant was happening, but unsure what questions were permitted. Calder appreciated their discretion. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing, already mentally rehearsing the conversation with Brennan that would define how the next phase unfolded. After dinner, despite Mrs. Chen's orders to rest, he walked down to the sheriff's office. The building was dark except for lamplight in the front window. Calder pushed through the door and found Brennan sitting at his desk, writing in a ledger. The sheriff looked up, his expression cycling through surprise and something more complicated. "Shaw, didn't expect you until morning." "Couldn't sleep. Figured we should talk now." Brennan set down his pen and gestured to a chair. "Mrs. Vale made it down safely?" "She did, staying at Chen's place." Calder sat but didn't relax. "She'll want to talk to you soon." "About what happened with the guide, about her plans for what comes next." "Her plans?" Brennan's tone was carefully neutral. "You're part of those plans?" "I am." "That's unexpected. No offense, but you're not exactly known for community involvement. Things change." "They do." Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying Calder with the same intensity his mother must have once used to assess students. "What exactly are Mrs. Vale's plans? People are already asking questions about why the town hermit brought her down from the mountain, why she's staying instead of continuing east to her daughter's place." Calder made a decision in that moment, one he'd been turning over since they'd started down the trail. They could try to keep their intentions secret, work in shadows like Morse had, hope to achieve their goals before opposition organized. Or they could be direct, transparent, and force the town to choose sides in the light of day. "She's going to rebuild the school," he said flatly. "File a homestead claim on federal land outside town jurisdiction and build a new schoolhouse. And I'm going to help her." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "That's ambitious. Also potentially illegal depending on how it's done. Also guaranteed to make Jacob Morse very angry." "Morse doesn't own federal land, can't stop legal homesteading." "No, but he can make the process difficult. File challenges, question her fitness to establish a claim, pressure the land office to slow down approval." Brennan paused. "He can also make life very difficult for anyone who helps her." "Is that a warning?" "It's a statement of fact. Morse has influence, money, and no particular attachment to playing fair." The sheriff's voice hardened slightly. "But he's not the only one with resources in this town. There are people who remember what Mrs. Vale did for their children, who know that education matters even if it doesn't generate immediate profit. You're one of them." "I am." Brennan stood and crossed to a map on the wall, similar to the one Calder had back in his cabin, but more detailed, showing property lines and ownership. "Where's she planning to file the claim?" Calder joined him at the map and pointed to the area south of Coldwater Creek. "Here. This peninsula, federal land, defensible position, close enough to town for students to reach easily." Brennan studied the location, his finger tracing the creek's path. "Smart choice. Morse owns property on the north bank, but he can't touch anything across the water without federal approval he'll never get." He turned to face Calder. "How can I help?" The question was so direct, so free of hesitation, that it caught Calder off guard. "You're sure? This could get complicated." "Mrs. Vale taught me to read when I was 7 years old. Spent hours after school helping me get past a stutter that made other kids mock me. Wrote letters to my mother about my progress that my mother kept until the day she died." Brennan's voice was steady, but carrying emotion underneath. "Then she wrote one final letter before I went to war. Letter that convinced my mother, and eventually me, that I could survive what was coming." "I know, I read it." "Then you know why I'm not even hesitating. Mrs. Vale saved my life before I ever reached the battlefield. Least I can do is help her fight this one." He returned to his desk and pulled out a stack of papers. "Homestead applications go through the federal land office in Carson City. That's a 2-week ride minimum, longer in winter. But I know the territorial administrator, served with him during the war. I can write a letter of support, expedite the process if we're careful about how we present it." Calder felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, the strange relief of not being alone in this fight, of having someone competent and committed standing alongside them. "There's something else," Brennan continued, his voice dropping slightly. "Something you should know about your son before this goes any further." Calder's breath caught. "What about him?" "He talked about you. During the war, when things got quiet between battles, he'd tell stories about growing up in the mountains, about his father teaching him to track and trap and read the weather." Brennan's eyes held steady on Calder's. "He was proud of you. Talked about you with this mix of frustration and admiration that I recognize because it's how I talked about my own father. But underneath it all was this absolute certainty that you'd taught him how to survive. Then why did he die? The words came out harsher than Calder intended. If I taught him so well, why didn't he come home? Because survival and sacrifice are different things. You taught him the first, Mrs. Vale taught him the second. Brennan moved closer, his voice gentle but unyielding. Daniel chose to hold that line at Ashford Valley. He knew what it would cost. He did it anyway because he believed some things were worth dying for. That's not a failure of your teaching. That's proof it worked. Calder turned away, unable to meet Brennan's eyes, his vision blurring. I let him leave angry. Never told him. He knew. Shaw, listen to me. Brennan waited until Calder looked at him again. Daniel's last words were about not running anymore. He said them to Marcus Webb, but they were meant for you. He was telling you that he'd learned the lesson, that he'd become the man you wanted him to be, that he forgave you for the fight and the silence and all of it. How do you know that? Because I was there. Not when he died. I was half a mile away holding a different position, but I was there afterward when Webb told us what Daniel said. And I knew immediately who the message was for. Brennan's expression softened. Your son died believing you'd be proud of him. Don't dishonor that by spending the rest of your life believing otherwise. The words hit Calder like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of Brennan's desk, his knuckles white, his breathing unsteady. 15 years of guilt and grief and carefully maintained distance crashed against this simple truth. Daniel had died with forgiveness on his lips and pride in his heart. Not running anymore. A message sent across death itself to the father who'd taught him to survive but had to learn from him what it meant to live with courage. I don't know how to carry this, Calder said quietly. This knowledge, this weight. You carry it by doing what you're already doing, by helping Mrs. Vale build something that honors what Daniel believed in, by proving that the lessons he learned and the courage he showed actually mattered. Brennan's hand came down on Calder's shoulder, solid and real. By not running anymore either. They stood like that for a moment. Two men connected by a boy who'd become a bridge between them, whose death had carved absence into both their lives, but whose memory now demanded something from them beyond grief. Finally, Calder straightened. The school. What do we need to do first? File the homestead claim immediately. Tomorrow if possible. The moment that's official, Morse's options narrow considerably. Brennan moved back to his desk and began writing rapidly. I'll draft the letter to Carson City tonight. Have it ready for you to take when you ride out. Meanwhile, we need to start gathering support quietly. People who'll stand with us when Morse pushes back. You think he'll use legal means or physical ones? Both. He'll start with lawyers and council meetings. When that doesn't work, he'll escalate. Brennan looked up. That's when things could get dangerous. You prepared for that? I've been living on a mountain for 15 years waiting for something worth fighting for. I'm prepared. Good. Because Mrs. Vale's going to need both of us before this is over. They worked late into the night, planning logistics and contingencies, identifying potential allies and probable enemies, mapping out a strategy that balanced legal maneuvering with practical construction timelines. By the time Calder left the sheriff's office, the moon had risen high and cold, casting sharp shadows across the empty street. He walked back to the boarding house slowly, his mind full of details and decisions, but underneath it all was the conversation about Daniel, the knowledge that his son's final thoughts had included forgiveness, that the anger between them hadn't been the last word after all, not running anymore. Calder understood now what Daniel had meant, not just that he'd stopped fleeing from danger, but that he'd stopped running from the complicated truth of loving someone imperfect, that he'd made peace with having a father who was flawed and distant and couldn't always say what mattered, but who'd still taught him skills that kept him alive as long as possible. And now it was Calder's turn to do the same, to stop running from the implications of his son's courage, to build something that would outlast his grief, to prove that Daniel's death had purchased something more than just 7 men's survival, that it had bought a future where other children learned the same lessons and carried them forward into whatever battles their generation faced. He reached the boarding house and climbed the stairs quietly, not wanting to disturb the other residents. But as he passed Lenora's door, it opened slightly. "Calder?" Her voice was hushed. "Is everything all right?" "It is. Talk to Brennan. He's with us." "I knew he would be. Did he—" She hesitated. "Did he tell you about Daniel?" "Some. Enough." Calder met her eyes in the dim hallway. "Thank you." "For what?" "For teaching him courage, for giving him something I couldn't, for making him believe he mattered." His voice roughened. "For keeping that belief alive even after the war took him." Lenora's expression crumpled slightly, tears catching lamplight. He did matter. They all mattered. Every student I ever taught, every child who learned that fear didn't have to win. They all mattered. "Then let's make sure everyone knows it. Let's build this school and fill it with kids who need the same lessons. Let's prove that Morse was wrong about education being wasteful." "We will." Lenora wiped her eyes. "Starting tomorrow." "Starting tomorrow," Calder agreed. He went to his room and lay down without undressing, staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed the day. The descent from the mountain, the arrival in Millbrook, the conversation with Brennan that had cracked open something he'd kept sealed for 15 years. Tomorrow they would file the homestead claim. Would begin the formal process of turning plan into reality. Would take the first irrevocable step toward confrontation with Jacob Morse and everything he represented. But tonight, Calder allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in over a decade. He allowed himself to believe that Daniel would be proud of what came next. That somewhere beyond death and distance and all the silence between them, his son was watching and approving and maybe even understanding that his father's long retreat from the world was finally ending, not running anymore. Neither of them, father and son, separated by death, but connected still by the courage that had passed between them, through the medium of an old teacher who refused to let either of them disappear into the wilderness without fighting to bring them back. Outside, the mountain loomed invisible in the darkness, waiting patient and eternal. But Calder wasn't looking toward the heights anymore. He was looking toward mourning, toward the work that awaited, toward the school that would rise from federal land despite opposition and doubt, toward a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. And in the quiet darkness of a rented room in a frontier town that was about to become a battlefield, the ghost of Coldwater Ridge finally laid his haunting to rest and became, once again, simply a man with purpose and tools and determination enough to build something that mattered. The mountain had taught him survival. Now it was time to learn construction. Morning came with this kind of crystalline clarity that made every edge in the world sharp enough to cut. Calder woke before dawn, dressed in clothes that felt strange after weeks in mountain gear, and descended to find Mrs. Chen already preparing breakfast. The boarding house kitchen smelled of coffee and frying bacon, ordinary scents that should have been comforting but instead felt like artifacts from a life he'd abandoned so long ago he'd forgotten how to inhabit it. Lenora appeared shortly after, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still testing her body's limits. They ate in silence, while Mrs. Chen moved around them with the efficient discretion that made her establishment successful. She asked no questions, offered no commentary, simply kept their cups filled and their plates full. "I'll need to see the land office administrator," Lenora said finally, setting down her fork. "File the homestead claim before word spreads that I'm planning something. Brennan's drafting support letters, said he'd have them ready by mid-morning." Calder pushed his plate aside, the food sitting heavy in his stomach. "But there's something we need to discuss first." "What?" "Once you file that claim, there's no going back. Morse will know, the whole town will know, and they'll come at us with everything they have." He met her eyes across the table. "You sure you want this fight? Because there are easier ways to honor teaching, quieter ways. I didn't survive a blizzard and climb down from a mountain just to choose the quiet way." Lenora's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. "I ran once. Let Morse burn down everything I built and didn't fight back hard enough. I won't make that mistake again. Even if fighting means losing? Especially if it means that, because at least then I'll lose standing up instead of running away." Calder nodded slowly. He understood that logic, had lived it himself for 15 years, though in his case standing up had looked like retreat to the mountains. But Lenora was right. Some battles had to be fought regardless of outcome, because the alternative was accepting that cruelty defined reality, and decent people had no recourse except surrender. They finished breakfast and walked together to the land office, a small building near the edge of town that processed federal claims and territorial transfers. The administrator was a thin man named Halford, who looked perpetually worried, as if the weight of bureaucracy had physically bent him over the years. "Mrs. Vale," he said when they entered, recognition immediate in his expression. "Heard you'd returned. Frankly, most of us thought you were dead." "I'm not." Lenore placed both hands on his desk, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd waited too long to say what mattered. "And I'm here to file a homestead claim. 160 acres south of Coldwater Creek, starting at the eastern boundary of Lot 47 and extending— Wait! Halford held up one hand, his worried expression deepening. "Mrs. Vale, you should know that filing a claim in that area might be complicated." "How so?" "Mr. Morse has expressed interest in that land. Nothing official yet, but he's made inquiries about potential purchase once it opens for private sale." "Federal homestead land doesn't get sold to private interests," Calder said flatly. "It gets claimed by settlers willing to improve it. That's the law." "Yes, but Mr. Morse has connections in Carson City, ways of expediting purchases that bypass normal homestead procedures." Halford's hands fluttered nervously. "I'm just saying, if you file this claim, you'll be stepping on some very influential toes." "Good," Lenora straightened. "I've spent too long tiptoeing around Jacob Morse's influence. File the claim, Mr. Halford. Unless you're telling me there's a legal reason I can't." "No legal reason, just practical concerns." "I'm not interested in practical concerns. I'm interested in what's legal." Halford sighed, defeated, and pulled out the necessary forms. They spent the next hour completing paperwork, documenting Lenore's intent to settle and improve the land, outlining the boundaries with precision, establishing timelines for construction and residency. Calder watched the process with growing recognition of how thoroughly Lenora had planned this, how every detail had been considered and accounted for. When they finally finished, Halford stamped the documents with visible reluctance. "It'll take 2 weeks minimum for approval from Carson City," he said, "possibly longer if there are challenges." "There will be challenges," Lenora predicted, "but they'll fail because the law is on my side." They left the land office and walked directly to the sheriff's office, where Brennan was waiting with the letters he'd promised. He looked up when they entered, his expression grave. "It's done?" he asked. "Filed and stamped," Lenore confirmed. "Halford tried to warn me off, said Morse had designs on that land." "He does, which means we probably have less time than I hoped before this gets ugly." Brennan handed Calder a sealed envelope. "This is for the territorial administrator in Carson City. Personal letter from me vouching for Mrs. Vale's character and the legitimacy of her claim. Should help expedite approval." "You want me to write it there myself?" Calder asked. "No, I'm sending Deputy Hayes. He's young but trustworthy, and frankly I need you here." Brennan moved to the map on his wall, pointing to the creek bend they'd identified. "We need to start gathering materials immediately. Lumber, nails, tools, everything required for construction. Store it quietly in locations that won't draw attention until we're ready to move." "Where?" Lenora asked. "Every storehouse in town will report back to Morse the moment we start buying in quantity." "Not every storehouse," Brennan tapped a spot on the map just outside town limits. "The old Miller property. Family abandoned it 3 years ago, moved east after drought killed their crops. Building still standing, structurally sound. It's technically federal land now, unclaimed. We can use it as a staging area." "And when Morse notices materials disappearing from Carson's store and ending up at the Miller place?" "By then we'll already be building. The harder question is manpower." Brennan turned to face them. "We'll need at least a dozen people to raise a schoolhouse in the timeline we're working with. People we can trust to keep quiet and work hard and not fold when Morse applies pressure." "I know some," Lenora said. "Former students, parents of children I taught. People who remember what the school meant before Morse destroyed it." "That's a start. But we need more than sentiment. We need skills. Carpenters, masons, people who know how to build properly." "There's a man named Chen," Calder said suddenly. "Mrs. Chen's husband. Haven't met him, but she mentioned he built half the structures in Millbrook before his back gave out. If he's willing to advise, that's worth 10 unskilled workers." Brennan nodded. "I'll talk to them." Meanwhile, we need to prepare for legal challenges. Morse won't just accept this quietly. He'll go to the territorial court, argue that Mrs. Vale isn't fit to establish a homestead claim, that the land should be preserved for commercial development. On what grounds? Lenora demanded. Any grounds he can manufacture. Your age, your health, lack of financial resources, previous abandonment of the town. He'll throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Then we'll need our own legal representation. Already thought of that. Brennan pulled another paper from his desk. There's a lawyer in Silver Creek, 2 days' ride from here. Man named Pritchard. He worked on homestead claims during the land rush, knows federal law better than anyone in the territory. I sent word asking if he'd be willing to take the case. And if he's not? Calder asked. Then we defended ourselves and hope the law is as clear as we think it is. Brennan's expression hardened. But one way or another, we're building this school, even if we have to do it with Morse's lawyers breathing down our necks. They spent the rest of the morning coordinating logistics, who would approach which potential supporters, how materials would be acquired without raising immediate suspicion, what the construction timeline needed to look like to establish undeniable progress before legal challenges could halt work. By noon, they had the outline of a plan that felt less like certain success and more like organized desperation. But it was something. And something was more than Calder had possessed a month ago when his entire world consisted of trap lines and silence. Over the following week, the plan began to take shape in ways both encouraging and terrifying. Lenora reached out to former students and their families, meeting them quietly in homes and back rooms, explaining her intentions and asking for support. Some refused immediately, too frightened of Morse's retribution to risk association. But others, more than Calder expected, agreed without hesitation. A carpenter named Morrison, who'd learned to read in Lenora's classroom, promised his tools and expertise. A widow named Sarah Blackwell, whose 3 sons had all been Lenora's students, offered her late husband's wagon for transporting materials. The blacksmith, a massive man named Stone, who rarely spoke but whose work was known throughout the territory, simply nodded when asked if he'd help and showed up at the Miller property the next day with his portable forge. Materials accumulated slowly at the old Miller homestead. Lumber arrived in small batches, purchased from Carson's store in quantities too modest to raise suspicion individually, but adding up to something substantial collectively. Nails, hammers, saws, levels, all the tools of construction appeared in the abandoned barn like offerings left by believers at a shrine. And through it all, Morse remained ominously quiet. He knows, Brennan said one evening as he, Calder, and Lenora reviewed progress in the sheriff's office. Has to. Halford probably told him the moment we left the land office. Then why hasn't he moved against us? Lenora asked. Because he's waiting to see how serious we are. Waiting to determine if this is just talk or actual threat. Brennan traced a finger across his desk, thinking, once we break ground, once it's undeniable that we're building, that's when he'll strike. He'll want to crush us publicly, make an example that discourages anyone else from challenging his authority. Let him try. Calder's voice was flat, certain. We're not backing down. I know. Just want you prepared for what's coming. What came 3 days later was worse than any of them anticipated. Calder was at the Miller property, helping Morrison measure and cut lumber for the frame, when Deputy Hayes rode up at a gallop, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Shaw, you need to get to town now. Calder set down his saw. What happened? Morse. He's called a town meeting at the hall, says he has information about Mrs. Vale that the community needs to hear before they support her reckless and dangerous scheme. Hayes's voice carried quotes around Morse's words. Sheriff says you should be there. They rode back together, arriving at the town hall to find it already packed. Seemed like half of Millbrook had turned out, drawn by the promise of drama and the opportunity to witness whatever confrontation Morse had orchestrated. Calder pushed through the crowd and found Lenora standing near the front, her face pale but composed. Brennan stood beside her, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a way that wasn't casual at all. At the front of the room, on the raised platform normally used for municipal announcements, stood Jacob Morse. Calder had heard descriptions of the man but never seen him in person. Morse was perhaps 60, well-dressed in city clothes that seemed designed to establish his superiority over the frontier population around him. His face was handsome in a calculated way, his expression carrying the confidence of someone who'd never encountered an obstacle money or influence couldn't overcome. He smiled when he saw Calder enter, the kind of smile predators give when prey walks into carefully laid traps. "Ah, Mr. Shaw, how good of you to join us. I was just telling these good people about your companion, Mrs. Vale." Morse's voice carried across the hall with practiced ease. "About the woman you've been helping, whose cause you've apparently taken up with such enthusiasm." "Get to the point, Morse," Brennan said sharply. "The point, Sheriff, is that Mrs. Vale has been presenting herself as a victim, as someone who had her school unjustly destroyed, who fled town due to persecution rather than personal failure." Morse pulled a paper from his jacket. "But I have here documentation that tells a very different story." "What documentation?" Lenore's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Financial records from the Territorial Education Board. Records showing that the school you ran was thousands of dollars in debt when it burned. That you had mismanaged funds, failed to pay suppliers, and were facing an official audit when the fire conveniently destroyed all evidence of your malfeasance." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Lenora went very still. "That's a lie," she said quietly. "Is it? Because these records suggest otherwise." Morse held up the paper like evidence in a trial. "They suggest that you're not the martyred teacher you claim to be, but rather a failed administrator who fled town to escape accountability. And now you're back, trying to establish another school using federal land and community support, despite your proven inability to manage educational institutions responsibly." "Let me see those records." Brennan stepped forward, his voice hard. "Of course. I have nothing to hide, unlike some people." Morse handed over the papers with exaggerated courtesy. Brennan scanned them quickly, his expression darkening. "These are forgeries." "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. Can you prove it? Can you prove they're legitimate? Because the Territorial Education Board doesn't issue documents with this signature style. I've seen enough official paperwork to recognize when something's been fabricated." "Then perhaps we should let the territorial authorities determine authenticity. In the meantime, I think the community deserves to know that Mrs. Vale's credibility is, at best, questionable." Morse turned to address the crowd directly. "I'm not saying we shouldn't support education. I'm saying we should be cautious about who we trust to provide it, about whether someone with Mrs. Vale's history is truly the best person to lead our children's learning." The crowd was murmuring agreement now, doubt spreading like water through cracked stone. Calder felt rage building in his chest, cold and focused and looking for a target. But Lenora spoke before he could. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. Everyone went quiet. Morse's expression shifted to surprise, mixed with satisfaction. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right that we should be cautious about who teaches our children, that we should demand accountability and transparency from educational institutions." Lenore walked forward slowly, her eyes locked on Morse. "Which is why I'm prepared to open every aspect of the new school to public scrutiny, to maintain detailed financial records available for community inspection, to establish a board of parents and citizens who oversee operations and ensure that what happened before, whatever actually happened, never happens again." That's very noble, but it doesn't address the question of your past mismanagement. Because there was no mismanagement. The school's finances were audited annually by the Territorial Board, and every audit came back clean. The debt you're referencing didn't exist. Lenore's voice strengthened. What did exist was a property dispute. You wanted the land where the school stood, and when I refused to sell, you began a campaign to destroy my reputation and force me out. The fire was just the final step in that campaign. You have no proof of that. Don't I? Lenore pulled a small leather journal from her coat. I kept records too, Mr. Morse. Detailed records of every conversation we had about selling. Every veiled threat. Every instance where suppliers suddenly refused to work with the school after meeting with you. Every time parents expressed concerns that mysteriously echoed arguments you'd made in council meetings. Morse's smile faltered slightly. Private notes aren't evidence. Then let's both submit our documentation to neutral authorities and see whose version holds up under scrutiny. Lenore's eyes blazed. I'm willing to have everything I've done examined in the light. Are you? The crowd had gone very quiet now, attention shifting between Morse and Lenora like spectators at a prize fight waiting to see who would land the decisive blow. Morse recovered quickly. This is a deflection. The issue isn't my business dealings, which are entirely legal and beneficial to this community. The issue is whether you're fit to run a school. Then let's make it simple, Lenora addressed the crowd directly. I'm proposing to build a school on federal land using federal homestead law. It will be funded by donations and managed by community oversight. Anyone who wants to help is welcome. Anyone who doesn't is free to stay away. But I will not be intimidated into silence by a man who destroyed my life's work once and thinks he can do it again. You're making a mistake, Morse said, his voice dropping to something colder. This town has limited resources, limited patience. If you force people to choose between supporting your school and maintaining good relations with the business interests that actually keep this community functioning, you'll find yourself very isolated very quickly. Is that a threat? Brennan asked quietly. It's a prediction, Sheriff, based on economic reality. Morse turned his attention to the crowd again. I'm simply asking people to think carefully about where their loyalties lie. With a woman who abandoned this town once and may do so again? Or with the established institutions that have sustained Millbrook through hard times? Several people in the crowd nodded. Others looked uncertain, but a few, including Morrison the carpenter and Sarah Blackwell, and old Mr. Chen, who'd been standing silent in the back, pushed forward to stand beside Lenora. I'm with Mrs. Vale, Morrison announced. She taught my daughter to read when everyone else said the girl was too slow to learn. I'll build her school, and anyone who wants to stop me can go to hell. Same here, Sarah Blackwell added. My boys learn more in Mrs. Vale's classroom than they did anywhere else. If she's building a new school, I'm helping. Chen didn't speak, just moved to stand on Lenora's other side, his presence making a statement that needed no words. The crowd began to split, not dramatically, but visibly. Some people edged toward the doors, clearly wanting no part of the conflict. Others moved closer to Lenora's growing group of supporters. The majority stayed frozen in the middle, uncertain which way to commit. Morse watched this happening with barely concealed fury. You're dividing this community, he said to Lenora, turning neighbor against neighbor over your personal vendetta. No, Calder spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through the tension. You did that 15 years ago when you decided your profit mattered more than children's education. You did it when you burned down a school and drove out the woman who ran it, and you're doing it now by trying to stop her from rebuilding what you destroyed. And who are you exactly? Morse turned his cold gaze on Calder. The mountain hermit who lives like an animal in the high country? What possible authority do you have to speak on community matters? I'm a man who hid from the world for 15 years because I couldn't face what I'd lost, who let pride and grief turn me into a ghost. Calder stepped forward. But I'm also Daniel Shaw's father, and my son died believing that education mattered, that teachers like Mrs. Vale mattered, that some things were worth fighting for even if the fight cost everything. He could feel the crowd's attention shift to him. This legendary hermit they'd gossiped about for years but rarely seen, suddenly standing in their town hall and speaking about things that obviously cost him dearly to articulate. Mrs. Vale taught my son courage, Calder continued. Taught him that being afraid was normal but giving up wasn't acceptable. He carried those lessons all the way to war, and when he died holding a line that saved 7 other men's lives. That's what her teaching produced. That's what you want to stop from happening again. Your son's death is tragic, but irrelevant. My son's death is the whole point. Calder's voice rose, 15 years of suppressed emotion finally breaking through. He believed in something, fought for something, sacrificed for something, and I'm not going to dishonor that by standing silent while you try to convince this town that education doesn't matter, that teachers don't matter, that the only thing worth protecting is your ability to buy land and build profit. The hall was absolutely silent now. We're building this school, Calder said flatly, with or without town support, on federal land where you have no authority to stop us. And if you try anyway, if you bring lawyers or hired men or any other kind of pressure, you'll find out exactly how much a man who spent 15 years alone on a mountain is capable of when he finally has something worth fighting for. Morse stared at him, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in the man's eyes. He'd expected to steamroll an old woman and a sheriff bound by legal constraints. He hadn't expected a mountain man willing to make threats that sounded less like bluster and more like promises. "This isn't over," Morse said quietly. "No," Lenora agreed, "it's not. But it will be. And when it is, there will be a school south of Coldwater Creek teaching children that fear doesn't have to win." "That's a certainty, Mr. Morse. The only question is how much damage you do to yourself trying to prevent it." Morse turned and walked out of the hall, his exit followed by perhaps a third of the crowd, people who'd decided that alliance with power trumped principle, or who simply wanted to avoid the conflict entirely. But two-thirds remained, and slowly, one by one, they began moving toward Lenora. A farmer who remembered how Mrs. Vale had taught his son basic arithmetic that helped the boy eventually take over the family accounts. A merchant whose daughter had learned confidence in Lenora's classroom. A mother who'd watched her shy child blossom under Lenora's patient encouragement. They came forward with offers of help, of materials, of time and labor and support. Not everyone, but enough. More than enough to make the impossible seem merely difficult. By the time the hall emptied, Lenora had commitments from 23 people willing to help build the school. Brennan had a list of names to contact for additional support. And Calder had the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being part of something larger than his own survival. "That was remarkable," Lenora said quietly as they walked back toward the boarding house. "What you said about Daniel, about fighting for what matters. It was true. Took me 15 years to understand it, but it was always true. He would be proud of you." "Maybe. Or maybe he'd tell me I was 15 years too late," Calder's voice roughened. "But late is better than never. That's something else you taught him, I think, that it's never too late to choose courage." They walked in silence for a while, the evening settling over Millbrook with the soft light that made even frontier towns look almost beautiful. "When do we start?" Lenore asked. "Tomorrow. We've got materials staged, people committed, and Morse knows we're serious. No point waiting. Waiting just gives him time to organize opposition." Calder looked toward the creek that marked the edge of federal land. "Tomorrow we break ground, and then we don't stop until there's a school standing where he can see it every time he looks south." Tomorrow came cold and clear, the kind of morning that felt like the world holding its breath. Calder, Lenora, and Brennan rode out to the creek bend at dawn, followed by a wagon train of supporters. Morrison with his carpenter's tools, Sarah Blackwell with her late husband's wagon full of lumber, Chen with advice and steady eyes that missed nothing. 20 people in total, each one carrying the knowledge that what they did today would define how the rest of this played out. The land south of Coldwater Creek was exactly as Calder remembered. High ground, protected on 3 sides by the water's curve, open to the south, where prairie stretched toward distant mountains. Good drainage, solid earth, close enough to town that children could walk here easily, but far enough that it felt like its own territory. Federal land. Beyond Morse's reach, at least legally. They unloaded materials in organized chaos, Morrison directing placement with the efficiency of someone who'd built half the structures in the territory. Foundation stones were positioned at measured intervals. Lumber was sorted by length and purpose. Tools were distributed to those who knew how to use them. And then, while Lenora watched with tears streaming down her face, Calder and Morrison drove the first stake into the ground. The sound echoed across the prairie, wood striking earth, the physical manifestation of intent becoming reality. They were building. The work progressed with surprising speed. Chen's advice proved invaluable, his experience directing labor in ways that maximized efficiency. By midday, they had the foundation marked and the first support posts set. By evening, the basic frame of the eastern wall was rising against the sky. People from town began appearing throughout the day, some to help, others just to watch. Word had spread about what was happening at the creek bend, and the community was responding by revealing its divisions. Those who supported the school came to assist or bring food and water. Those who opposed it stayed away or appeared briefly to observe with frowns and muttered commentary. Morse himself arrived near sunset. He rode up alone, sitting his horse at the edge of the property line. watching the construction with an expression that flickered between rage and calculation. Brennan noticed him first and walked over slowly, his hand near his gun. "This is federal land, Morse. You have no authority here." "I'm not on federal land. I'm on the territorial road, which is public access." Morse's voice was controlled but tight. "I'm simply observing criminal activity." "What criminal activity would that be?" "Trespassing on land that hasn't been officially approved for homestead claim, construction without proper permits, possibly fraud regarding misses. Vale's intentions to actually settle this land rather than just using homestead law to circumvent proper purchase procedures. The claim's been filed, approval's pending. Federal law allows preliminary improvements during the approval period." Brennan's tone was patient but hard. "You know this. You're just throwing out accusations, hoping something sounds legitimate enough to create doubt. We'll see what the territorial court thinks. File whatever legal challenges you want. But while you're filing, we'll be building. And by the time any judge hears your arguments, there will be a completed schoolhouse standing here teaching children to read." Morse's jaw tightened. He stared past Brennan at where Lenora was helping sort materials, at where Calder was working alongside Morrison on the frame, at the 20 citizens of Millbrook who'd chosen to defy his implicit authority. "You're making enemies you can't afford," he said quietly. "No, I'm helping friends stand up to a bully. There's a difference." Brennan stepped closer. "And Morse? If anything happens to these people, if there are any mysterious fires or accidents or violent encounters, I'll be investigating with the assumption that you're responsible. Make any move against this school and you'll find out exactly how inconvenient the law can be when it's pointed at you instead of working in your favor." They stared at each other for a long moment, two men who represented different visions of what Millbrook could become. Then Morse turned his horse and rode away without another word. Construction continued for 3 weeks straight. The work was brutal, long days of physical labor that left everyone exhausted and aching. But the school grew anyway, rising from the prairie like something inevitable. Walls took shape, roof beams stretched across the frame, windows were installed, real glass that Morrison had somehow acquired from a supplier in Silver Creek. More people joined as the structure became undeniable. Parents who'd been uncertain committed when they saw actual progress. Former students of Lenora's arrived from neighboring settlements, drawn by word that their old teacher was rebuilding. Even a few of Morse's allies quietly sent materials or money, unwilling to publicly defy him but privately hoping the school succeeded. The legal challenges came exactly as predicted. Morse filed papers with the territorial court arguing that Lenora's claim should be denied on grounds of financial instability and questionable intent. But Pritchard, the lawyer from Silver Creek, proved as competent as Brennan promised, filing counter-arguments that systematically dismantled every accusation. And through it all, Calder worked. He hauled lumber until his shoulders screamed. He hammered nails until his hands cramped. He worked alongside Morrison learning carpentry techniques he'd never needed on his mountain, discovering that building was harder than surviving, but more satisfying in ways he couldn't articulate. At night, he'd return to Mrs. Chen's boarding house too tired to think, too exhausted to do anything except collapse into sleep that was mercifully free of the dreams that had haunted him for 15 years. He was too busy building to be haunted by ghosts. On the 28th day of construction, they finished. The school stood complete, a solid structure of wood and stone and glass, 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a peaked roof that would shed snow and a chimney for the stove that would keep children warm through winter. It wasn't ornate, but it was sturdy, built to last, built to matter. Lenore stood in front of it with her hand pressed to her mouth, crying again, but this time the tears were different. Not grief or pain, but something closer to joy mixed with disbelief that this had actually happened. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's a building," Calder said. But he was smiling. "It's more than that. It's proof that the things we fight for can actually manifest. That belief backed by work creates reality." She turned to look at everyone who'd helped, Morrison and Sarah Blackwell and Chen and all the others who'd given time and sweat and faith to this project. "Thank you. All of you. This isn't my school. It's ours. It belongs to the community that built it." They celebrated that night with a gathering at the new schoolhouse, food brought by families, music provided by a farmer who played fiddle, children running between adults with the thoughtless energy of the young. The building that had been empty hours earlier was suddenly full of life and laughter, and the kind of hope that only comes from collective accomplishment. Morse didn't appear, but his absence was loud, a reminder that the fight wasn't truly over, even if the immediate battle had been won. 2 days later, the federal approval arrived. Lenora's homestead claim was officially recognized. The land was legally hers, the school legally permitted, and every one of Morse's legal challenges had been denied by both territorial court and federal land office. Brennan brought the paperwork to the schoolhouse personally, grinning wider than Calder had ever seen. It's done, official and final. The school stands, and there's nothing Morse can do about it. Lenora took the papers with shaking hands and read through them twice, as if expecting the words to change on subsequent readings. Then she sat down heavily on one of the benches Morrison had built and simply breathed. "I can't believe it worked," she said finally. "You doubted?" Calder asked. "Every single day. I thought Morse would find some way to stop us, some legal loophole or political pressure or just raw force to tear down what we'd built." "He still might," Brennan cautioned. "This doesn't change his influence or his anger, it just limits his options." "Then we'll be ready." Lenora stood, her moment of vulnerability passing. "When does the term start?" "Term? School term. When do we open for students?" Brennan and Calder exchanged glances. "You want to start immediately?" Brennan asked. "Why wait? The building's ready. I'm ready. The only question is whether there are students who want to learn." There were. Word spread through Millbrook that Mrs. Vale's school was officially open, and within a week, 17 children had enrolled. Some were from families who'd supported the construction from the beginning. Others came from parents who'd been uncertain, but were willing to give education a chance now that it was real, rather than theoretical. The first day of class, Calder stood outside the schoolhouse watching children file through the door. Boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 14, carrying slates and primers, and the kind of nervous excitement that came with new beginnings. Lenora stood at the doorway greeting each one by name, many of them children of her former students, the next generation receiving the same attention and care their parents had received decades earlier. Through the open door, Calder could see inside. Benches arranged in neat rows, a blackboard mounted on the front wall, books on shelves that Morrison had built, maps and charts and all the materials of learning organized with the precision of someone who'd been preparing for this moment through years of forced absence. Lenora caught his eye and smiled. Then she stepped inside and closed the door. And through the window, Calder could see her beginning the lesson, her voice carrying faintly across the prairie as she started teaching the next generation of frontier children that they were capable of more than they believed. He stood there for a long time, watching and listening, feeling something shift inside him that he couldn't name but recognized as important. Then he walked back toward town, past the creek that marked the boundary between federal land and municipal territory, past buildings and businesses and lives continuing in their ordinary patterns. He stopped at the small cemetery on the hill above Millbrook. He'd avoided this place for 15 years, unable to face the absence it represented. But today, with the school standing solid behind him and Lenora's voice drifting on the wind, he made himself walk through the iron gate. The graves were marked simply, wooden crosses and stone markers, names and dates recording lives that had come and gone in this hard country. He moved among them until he found what he was looking for. A stone marker, weathered but still legible. Daniel Shaw, beloved son, he fought with courage. Calder knelt beside it, his hand resting on the cold stone. "I built something," he said quietly. "Helped build it, anyway. A school where kids will learn the same lessons Mrs. Vale taught you. Where they'll discover they're braver than they think, stronger than they believe, capable of more than their circumstances suggest." The wind moved through the grass, carrying no answer except the one Calder provided himself. "I know you can't hear me. Know you're gone, and this is just me talking to stone and dirt and memory. But I needed to say it anyway. Needed to tell you that I finally understood what you were trying to teach me when you went to war despite my anger." He paused, gathering the words that had been building for weeks. "You were showing me that some things are worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible. That running from fear just gives fear more power. That courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and moving forward anyway. His voice roughened, broke, steadied again. I'm sorry I let you leave angry. Sorry I never wrote back. Sorry I spent 15 years hiding instead of honoring what you believed in. He stood slowly, his hand lingering on the stone. But I'm not running anymore. Neither of us are. He walked back down the hill toward town, toward the boarding house where he'd been staying, toward the life he was slowly, painfully learning to rebuild. Mrs. Chen was in her kitchen when he arrived, preparing the evening meal. She looked up when he entered. You went to the cemetery. It wasn't a question. Somehow she knew. I did. Good. Past needs visiting sometimes, or it follows you around like hungry ghost. She returned to chopping vegetables. You staying in Millbrook? Calder paused in the doorway. He'd been asking himself the same question for days. Don't know yet. Haven't decided. Mountain's still there if you want it. It is. But school needs maintenance. Mrs. Vale needs support. Community needs someone who understands what fighting for something costs. Chen's knife moved with rhythmic precision. Mountain doesn't need you, just takes what you give and gives nothing back except silence. Silence can be valuable. So can connection. Question is which one you need more. Calder thought about the cabin waiting high above the valley, about the solitude that had been his refuge and his prison. Then he thought about the school standing on federal land, about children learning to read, about Lenora teaching them courage the same way she'd taught Daniel. I'll stay through winter, he said finally. Make sure the building's sound, help with repairs, see how things develop. And after winter? We'll see. Chen nodded, satisfied. You eat dinner here tonight, no charge. Man who helps build school deserves good meal. The winter that followed was different from the 15 that had preceded it. Instead of isolation on the mountain, Calder spent it in Millbrook, living at the boarding house and working as the school's unofficial caretaker and guardian. He maintained the building, repaired damage from early winter storms, split wood for the stove that kept children warm during lessons. He also served as quiet deterrent to interference. Morse made no overt moves against the school, but his anger simmered beneath the surface, occasionally manifesting in bureaucratic obstacles or whispered campaigns to undermine community support. But every time someone suggested maybe the school wasn't worth the division it caused, every time doubt began spreading, Calder was there, silent and solid and radiating the kind of determination that made opposition reconsider whether the fight was worth it. The school thrived. Enrollment grew to 24 students by midwinter. Parents reported their children coming home excited about learning, asking questions and demonstrating knowledge that surprised adults who'd assumed education was luxury rather than necessity. The community began to shift, gradually recognizing that maybe Lenora had been right. Maybe education did matter. Maybe investing in children's minds was as important as investing in livestock and land. And slowly, reluctantly, even some of Morse's allies began sending their children to the school. Spring came early that year, melting snow faster than expected and opening the high country trails weeks ahead of schedule. Calder felt the pull of the mountain as the weather warmed. The familiar call of altitude and solitude and the simple rhythms of survival he'd lived for so long. But he didn't answer it. Instead, he helped Lenora expand the school, adding another room for older students, building shelves for the growing library that donations had created. He taught occasional lessons on wilderness survival and mountain weather, subjects he knew intimately and discovered he could share more easily than he'd expected. On a warm April afternoon, Calder was replacing boards on the school's front step when a rider approached from the direction of town. He looked up to see Thomas Brennan dismounting, his expression serious. Shaw. Got news. Calder set down his hammer. What kind? Morse is leaving, selling his properties and moving to Carson City. Calder stood slowly. Why? Says the territory's too primitive for serious business development, that he's wasted enough time trying to civilize a place that doesn't want civilization. Brennan's mouth twitched slightly. But between you and me, I think he finally realized he'd lost, that the school was going to succeed regardless of his opposition, and staying just meant being reminded daily that his authority had limits. So he's running. He's retreating, There's a difference. They stood in silence for a moment, both recognizing the significance of this development. The primary obstacle to the school's existence was removing itself, not through defeat and direct confrontation, but through the slower erosion of realizing that some fights couldn't be won with money and influence alone. Mrs. Vale should know, Calder said finally. She already does. I stopped at the school first. Brennan looked toward the building. She said something I thought you should hear. What? She said Morse leaving doesn't mean we won. It just means the battle's over. The real victory will be measured in decades, in the students who learn here and what they do with that education, and whether the community continues supporting the school long after we're all gone. Calder nodded slowly. She's right. She usually is. Brennan extended his hand. Thank you for everything you did to make this happen. The town won't forget. The town will forget eventually. That's what towns do. Calder shook Brennan's hand firmly. But maybe the students won't. Maybe they'll remember that someone believed in them enough to fight for their education. That's legacy enough. Brennan mounted his horse and rode back toward Millbrook, leaving Calder alone with his thoughts and his repairs and the sound of children's voices drifting through the open schoolhouse windows. Summer arrived in its full fierce glory, turning the prairie into a sea of wildflowers and the school into a hub of constant activity. Lenora organized community gatherings, bringing families together for picnics and celebrations that gradually healed the divisions Morse had exploited. The school became more than just an educational institution. It became the heart of a community remembering how to value things beyond immediate profit. And through it all, Calder remained. Not as a teacher or administrator, but as steady presence. The mountain man who descended from his isolation and discovered that building something meaningful required more courage than surviving alone had ever demanded. On a late August evening, Calder sat outside the schoolhouse watching the sun set over the western peaks. The building cast long shadows across the prairie, solid and real and permanent in ways that mattered. Lenora emerged and sat beside him on the bench Morrison had built for this exact purpose. "Beautiful night," she said. "It is." "You thinking about the mountain?" Calder smiled slightly. "How'd you know?" "Because I know what it's like to have a place that represents escape, to feel its pull even when you've committed to staying." She paused. "Are you going back?" "Eventually, not permanently, but—" He struggled to articulate what he was feeling. "The mountain's part of who I am. The solitude, the simplicity, the direct relationship with survival. Can't just abandon that completely." "Nor should you. Balance is important. Time alone to think, time together to build." Lenora looked at him directly. "But Calder, you should know you're welcome here, not just as maintenance help or muscle when needed, but as part of this community, as someone who belongs." The words hit harder than he'd expected. Belonging. It was such a simple concept, but one he'd rejected for 15 years, convinced that he didn't deserve connection after failing his son. But maybe Brennan had been right. Maybe Daniel's death hadn't been punishment for Calder's failures, but rather a final gift. The gift of demonstrating through sacrifice what truly mattered. The gift of showing that courage was always available if you were willing to pay its price. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a reason to come down, for teaching Daniel what I couldn't, for not giving up on this when giving up would have been so much easier." "We gave each other reasons," Lenora corrected gently. "I wouldn't have had the courage to return and fight if you hadn't shown me what that looked like. We saved each other, Calder. That's what community does." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed designed to make the world look briefly like something holy. Somewhere high above the valley, Calder's cabin waited empty but intact, ready to welcome him back whenever he needed the mountain's particular form of silence. But for now, for this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, sitting beside a woman who taught his son courage. In front of a school they'd built together against impossible odds, part of a community that was learning that education mattered, that teachers mattered, that fighting for what was right sometimes meant standing up to power regardless of the cost. The sun set completely, and stars began emerging in the darkening sky, the same stars that shone over the high peaks, over Daniel's grave, over the vast territory that was slowly, painfully, learning that civilization required more than commerce and extraction. It required belief in children's potential, in teachers' wisdom, in the idea that knowledge passed from one generation to the next was the foundation on which everything else was built. Caldershaw had spent 15 years running from that truth, but he wasn't running anymore. Neither was Lenora Vale. And somewhere in the darkness, in the space between memory and hope, Daniel Shaw's sacrifice had purchased exactly what he'd fought for: a future where courage was taught and learned and passed forward like a flame that refused to be extinguished by wind or doubt or the kind of cruelty that thought-burning buildings could kill ideas. The school stood. The students learned. The mountain waited. And the man who'd been a ghost for 15 years was finally, fully, completely alive.